I see you're awake again. It's okay. Sometimes sleep just isn't ready when we are. While you wait for it to find you, let me share 5 calm, eerie stories. Nothing too sharp or overwhelming. Just enough to guide your thoughts somewhere softer as the rain keeps time outside. Story 1. Someone left a single footprint inside my apartment. The thing that still bothers me even now isn't that someone was inside my apartment. It's that there was only one footprint, just one. A single muddy impression in the middle of my living room floor, perfectly formed, pointing toward the front door. Not a trail of prints leading in from somewhere. Not a pair of prints suggesting someone had stood there and then walked away. Just one, like whoever made it had materialized out of thin air, taken a single step, and then vanished. I've thought about it 1,000 times since then, trying to make it make sense. I still can't. I'd been living in that apartment for about 4 months when it started. It was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a mid-rise building in the kind of neighborhood that's not quite nice but not quite bad. The sort of place where you nod at your neighbors in the hallway but never learn their names. I'd moved there after my divorce. When the house we'd shared became too big and too quiet and too full of memories I didn't want to keep tripping over. The apartment was supposed to be a fresh start. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere that didn't remind me of anything. It was fine, as apartments go. Decent-sized living room, small kitchen, bedroom that fit a queen bed and not much else. The building was old. 1970s construction, all beige brick and narrow hallways, but it had been updated enough to feel livable. New appliances, fresh paint, carpet that didn't smell like the previous tenant. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors sometimes, muffled conversations and television sounds bleeding through from either side. But I got used to it. In a way, it was almost comforting. Proof that other people existed, that I wasn't completely alone. I worked from home most days, freelance graphic design, which meant I spent a lot of time in that apartment. I'd set up a desk in the corner of the living room, facing the window so I could watch the rain when it came. And that winter, it came a lot. Seattle in February is basically one long gray drizzle, interrupted by occasional moments of slightly heavier drizzle. I'd sit at my desk with coffee going cold beside me, listening to the rain tap against the glass, and I'd lose hours without realizing it. It was peaceful in its way, lonely, but peaceful. The day I found the footprint was a Thursday. I remember because I'd forced myself to leave the apartment for the first time in 3 days, driven by a refrigerator that had nothing in it but condiments and a half-empty carton of milk that was starting to smell suspicious. I'd walked to the grocery store a few blocks away, bought enough food to last another week of hermitage, and walked back with plastic bags cutting into my fingers and rain soaking through my jacket. I was thinking about nothing in particular when I unlocked my door. What I was going to make for dinner. Whether I had the energy to actually cook, or if I'd just microwave something and call it a meal. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, set the bags down on the kitchen counter, started putting things away. It wasn't until I walked into the living room to check something on my computer that I saw it. The footprint was right in the middle of the floor, maybe 6 feet from my desk. It was mud, dark, wet mud, the kind that comes from actual dirt rather than just street grime. The shape was clear and distinct, a left foot, what looked like a men's work boot or hiking shoe, size 10 or 11 maybe, bigger than my foot, definitely not my shoe. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, my brain trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. My first thought was that I must have tracked it in myself, somehow, without noticing. But that didn't make sense. I'd been wearing sneakers, not boots, and I hadn't walked through any mud, just wet pavement, the same wet pavement I walked on every time I left the building. Besides, the print was pointing toward the door. If I'd tracked it in, it would be pointing the other way, into the apartment. This was facing out, like someone had been standing in my living room, facing my front door, like someone had been waiting. I checked the rest of the apartment, the bedroom, the bathroom, the closet, behind the shower curtain. I even looked under the bed, feeling stupid but unable to stop myself. There was no one there. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. My laptop was still on my desk. My wallet was still in my jacket pocket. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, except for the muddy footprint in the middle of my floor that had no business being there. I thought about calling someone. The building manager, maybe, or the police. But what would I say? Someone left a footprint in my apartment? They'd think I was crazy. They'd tell me I must have tracked it in myself. Must have forgotten. Must be confused. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe I was making something out of nothing, letting the loneliness and the gray February days get to me. It was just a footprint. It didn't mean anything. I got a paper towel and cleaned it up, watched the mud smear across the carpet, then disappear into the wet brown of the paper. When I was done, there was nothing left, just a faint, damp spot that would dry by morning. No evidence, no proof, just my own unsettled feeling, that prickling at the back of my neck that wouldn't quite go away. That night, I double-checked the locks before I went to bed, tested the deadbolt twice, made sure the chain was on. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about, that the footprint was a fluke, some weird anomaly I'd never be able to explain. I almost believed it, but I couldn't stop thinking about the direction it was pointing, toward the door. Not like someone walking in, like someone walking out, like someone had been standing in my living room waiting and then left just before I got home. Like they knew exactly when I'd be back. I told myself I'd forget about it. That's what you do with things that don't make sense. You file them away, let time sand down the edges until they don't feel so sharp anymore. A week would pass, then two, and the footprint would become just another weird thing that happened once, a story I might tell at a party if it ever came up. Remember that time I found a random footprint in my apartment? So strange. Anyway, but I couldn't forget. Every time I walked through my living room, my eyes went to that spot on the carpet. The damp mark had dried and faded, leaving no trace, but I knew exactly where it had been. I'd catch myself staring at it while I waited for my coffee to brew, while I sat at my desk pretending to work, while I passed through on my way to the bedroom at night. It was like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing, tender and insistent. A week after the footprint, I noticed the bathroom cabinet was open. It's a small thing. I know it's a small thing. The cabinet above my sink, where I kept toothpaste and floss and the prescriptions I rarely remembered to take. I'm not obsessive about closing it. Sometimes I'd leave it ajar after grabbing something in a hurry, and it would stay that way until I noticed and pushed it shut. But this was different. The cabinet was wide open, swung out as far as it would go, and I hadn't used it in at least 2 days. I'd been brushing my teeth in a fog that week, going through the motions without really thinking, and I was certain, that I hadn't opened that cabinet. I stood in the bathroom doorway and stared at it, my toothbrush forgotten in my hand. The rain was coming down hard outside, drumming against the small frosted window above the shower, and the sound seemed to fill the silence in a way that made me feel more alone rather than less. I told myself I was being ridiculous, told myself I'd opened the cabinet and forgotten about it, that my memory wasn't as reliable as I thought, that the isolation was starting to play tricks on my brain. I closed the cabinet, finished brushing my teeth, and went to bed. The next morning, my desk chair was pulled out. I always push it in when I'm done working. It's one of those habits I developed without meaning to, the kind of small ritual that becomes automatic after enough repetition. Push the chair in, turn off the monitor, adjust the mouse so it's parallel to the keyboard. I'd done it the night before. I remembered doing it, could almost feel the phantom sensation of my hands on the back of the chair. But when I walked into the living room that morning, the chair was pulled out at an angle, like someone had just stood up from it. I checked my computer. The screen was locked, same as always, and when I logged in, nothing seemed different. No strange files, no programs I hadn't opened, no evidence that anyone had touched it. But the chair was wrong. The chair was in the wrong place. That was when I started to get really scared. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened alertness that made my skin feel too tight for my body. I started taking pictures of things before I left the apartment. The position of the chair, the angle of the bathroom cabinet, the exact arrangement of items on my kitchen counter. I'd come back and compare, looking for differences, looking for proof that I wasn't imagining things. Most of the time, everything matched. The cabinet stayed closed. The chair stayed pushed in. Nothing moved. But sometimes, not often, maybe once or twice that week, something was different. A glass I'd left on the counter was now in the sink. A throw pillow on the couch was at the opposite end from where I'd put it. My TV remote was on the coffee table when I was sure I'd left it on the arm of the couch. Small things, tiny things. The kind of things you could easily dismiss as forgetfulness or carelessness or just not paying attention, except I was paying attention. I was paying more attention than I'd ever paid to anything in my life. I thought about telling someone. My sister lived across the country, but we talked on the phone sometimes, and I thought about mentioning it to her. Hey, I think someone might be coming into my apartment when I'm not here, but the words felt absurd even in my head. What was I supposed to say? Someone moved my remote. Someone opened my bathroom cabinet. I found a footprint. She'd think I was having a breakdown. She'd probably be right to think that. Instead, I went to the building manager. His name was Carl, a heavy-set guy in his 50s who always seemed vaguely annoyed by everything. I caught him in the lobby on a Tuesday afternoon and asked, as casually as I could, if anyone else had a key to my unit. He looked at me like I'd asked if the building was haunted. "Just you and the emergency master," he said. "Why? You lose your key?" "No, I thought I heard someone in my apartment the other day, when I wasn't there. Probably just the neighbors." Carl grunted. "These walls are paper thin. You can hear a mouse fart 3 units over. It was probably nothing." Probably nothing. That's what everyone would say. Probably nothing. You're probably imagining it. You're probably just stressed, just lonely, just not sleeping well. Probably. I thanked Carl and went back to my apartment, locked the door behind me, checked the rooms again, bedroom, bathroom, closet, under the bed. Empty. All empty. But that night, lying in bed and listening to the rain against my window, I couldn't shake the feeling that empty didn't mean alone. That somewhere in my apartment, in some corner I couldn't see, or some shadow I hadn't thought to check, someone was waiting, watching, counting the minutes until I fell asleep. I didn't sleep much that night, or the night after that. By the end of that week, I'd become a person I didn't recognize. I was checking locks compulsively, sometimes 3 or 4 times before I could convince myself to step away from the door. I'd started wedging a chair under the doorknob at night, something I'd seen in movies and always thought was paranoid nonsense. I kept a hammer on my nightstand within easy reach, and I'd lie awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the building, trying to separate the normal sounds from something else. Something wrong. The rain had been constant for days, that relentless Pacific Northwest gray that seeps into everything and makes the world feel smaller. I hadn't left the apartment in almost a week. I'd been living on crackers and canned soup and whatever I could order for delivery, too afraid to go outside for more than the 30 seconds it took to grab a package from the hallway. Every time I opened my door, I expected to see someone standing there. Every time I turned a corner in my own home, my heart would stutter in my chest, bracing for something that never came. I decided to set a trap, not anything elaborate. I didn't have the resources or the expertise for that, just something simple, something that would tell me, definitively, whether I was losing my mind or whether someone was actually coming into my apartment. I bought a cheap wireless camera online, the kind you can monitor from your phone. It arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and I spent an hour figuring out how to set it up, positioning it on a bookshelf in my living room, where it had a clear view of the front door and most of the main space. The angle wasn't perfect. I couldn't see into the kitchen or the hallway that led to the bedroom, but it was something. If anyone came through that door while I was gone, I would see them. The next morning, I forced myself to leave. I needed groceries anyway, and more than that, I needed to test the system. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and walked to the door. Then I stopped, turned around and took a photo of the living room with my phone. The position of the chair, the angle of the laptop screen, the throw blanket draped over the arm of the couch. Evidence, proof of how things were supposed to look. I was gone for 45 minutes. I walked to the store, bought milk and bread and frozen dinners, and walked back. The whole time, I kept checking the camera app on my phone, watching the grainy feed of my empty apartment. Nothing moved. The door stayed closed. The room stayed still. When I got back, the first thing I did was compare. I stood in the doorway and looked at my phone, at the photo I'd taken before I left, and then at the room in front of me. Chair, same position. Laptop, same angle. Blanket, same drape over the arm of the couch. But something was different. It took me a minute to see it. My eyes kept scanning the room, comparing details, and at first, everything seemed to match. Then I noticed the coffee mug. I'd left it on my desk, next to the keyboard. A mug with a faded logo from a company I used to work for. It was still on the desk, but it had been moved. Not much, maybe 2 inches to the left, but enough that it was now sitting on a coaster instead of directly on the wood. I never used coasters. I didn't even own coasters, or so I'd thought. But there it was, a round cork coaster that I'd never seen before, with my mug sitting neatly on top of it. My hands were shaking as I opened the camera app and scrolled back through the footage. I watched myself leave, watched the door close behind me, watched the empty room sit in silence. 10 minutes, 20, 30, nothing. No one came in. No one touched anything. The mug didn't move, but it had moved. I was looking right at it. It was in a different position on a coaster that hadn't existed 45 minutes ago. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The footage showed nothing. The mug showed everything. Someone had been in my apartment, had moved my things, had left behind a coaster like some kind of calling card, and the camera hadn't recorded any of it. That was when I started to shake. Not just my hands, my whole body, this deep involuntary tremor that I couldn't control. I sat down on the couch because I wasn't sure my legs would hold me, and I pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw stars. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Either I was losing my mind, having some kind of psychotic break, or someone had found a way to get into my apartment without being seen, without being recorded, without leaving any trace except the things they moved and the objects they left behind. I thought about the footprint, the single muddy footprint, pointing toward the door. I thought about all the small things that had been wrong. The cabinet, the chair, the glass, the pillow. And I thought about the coaster, that innocent little cork circle that I had never bought and never seen, and that was now sitting on my desk like it had always been there. Someone was sending me a message. I didn't know what the message was, didn't know what they wanted or why they'd chosen me. But they wanted me to know they could get in, that locks didn't matter, that cameras didn't matter, that I could take every precaution in the world and it wouldn't make a difference. They wanted me to know I wasn't safe. I called my sister that night. It was late, almost midnight her time, but she picked up on the third ring, and when she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. I told her everything, the footprint, the moved objects, the camera that showed nothing. I talked for almost an hour, the words spilling out of me in a rush that I couldn't have stopped even if I'd wanted to. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You need to call the police," she said finally. "I know it sounds crazy, but you need to report this. Even if they don't believe you, there needs to be a record. And then you need to get out of that apartment, tonight. Go to a hotel, go anywhere, but don't stay there alone." She was right. I knew she was right. But when I hung up the phone, I didn't call the police. I didn't pack a bag. I just sat on my couch in the dim light of my living room, listening to the rain against the windows and staring at that cork coaster on my desk. I should have left. I should have run. But I was so tired, and the fear had settled into something heavier, something that felt almost like resignation. Wherever I went, I thought, they would find me. They'd already proven that locks didn't stop them, that cameras didn't see them. What made me think distance would make any difference? So I stayed. I stayed, and I waited, and I tried not to think about what might happen when they decided to stop leaving messages and start doing something else. 3 nights later, I woke up at 3:47 a.m. with the absolute certainty that someone was in the room with me. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything. The bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds, and the rain had stopped for once, leaving the night heavy and silent. But I knew, the way you know when someone's staring at you from across a crowded room, that primal awareness that bypasses logic and goes straight to the animal part of your brain. Something was wrong. Something was here. I lay perfectly still, my eyes open, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The hammer was still on my nightstand, inches from my hand, but I couldn't make myself reach for it. Moving felt dangerous, like it would break some fragile equilibrium, like the moment I acknowledged that I was awake, whatever was in the room would know too. So I just lay there, barely breathing, scanning the shadows for movement. The closet door was open. I always kept it closed, another one of those compulsive habits I'd developed since the footprint. I'd checked it before bed, made sure the door was shut and the interior was empty, and now it was open. Not all the way, just a few inches, a dark gap that could have been nothing or could have been hiding anything. I stared at that gap until my eyes burned, waiting for something to emerge, waiting for a shape to materialize out of the darkness. Nothing came. The minutes stretched on, each one longer than the last, and eventually the tension in my body became impossible to sustain. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on, flooding the room with harsh yellow light. The room was empty. Closet, corners, the space beneath the bed that I forced myself to check even though my hands were shaking. All empty. I was alone. Whatever presence I'd felt, whatever had woken me from a dead sleep with the conviction that I was being watched, it was gone now, if it had ever been there at all. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. A nightmare, maybe. A half-waking hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. The closet door could have swung open on its own. Old buildings shift. Doors don't always stay latched. There were explanations. But even as I ran through them, I didn't believe any of them. The feeling had been too strong, too real. That was when I noticed the photograph. It was lying on the floor next to my nightstand, face down, a white rectangle against the dark carpet. I didn't own any printed photographs. Everything I had was digital, stored on my phone or my computer. I stared at it for a long moment, not wanting to pick it up, not wanting to know what was on the other side. But I had to know. The not knowing would be worse. I reached down and turned it over. It was a picture of me, sleeping, taken from somewhere above and to the left, the angle suggesting the photographer had been standing right next to my bed, looking down at me. My face was slack, my eyes closed, one arm thrown across the pillow. The timestamp in the corner read 2:34 a.m., barely an hour before I'd woken up. The sheets in the photo were the same sheets I was sitting on now, rumpled in exactly the same way. Someone had been standing over me while I slept. They'd taken a photograph, and then they'd left it beside my bed, like a gift, like a message, like proof that they could do whatever they wanted, and I would never know until they decided to tell me. I think I might have screamed. I don't remember exactly. The next few minutes are a blur of motion and panic. I remember grabbing my phone, my keys, my wallet. I remember shoving my feet into shoes without bothering to tie them. I remember running down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time because waiting for the elevator felt impossible, bursting through the lobby doors into the cold February night. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, standing under the awning of a closed coffee shop, the rain that had started again soaking through my shirt. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the fear or both. I called 911 with numb fingers and tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. Someone in my apartment. A photograph. They were watching me sleep. I don't know how they got in. Please, you have to help me. The police came. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both of them looking at me with that particular expression cops get when they're not sure if they're dealing with a crime or a mental breakdown. I showed them the photograph. I took them back to my apartment, hovering in the doorway while they searched the rooms and watched as they found exactly what I knew they'd find. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. No fingerprints that didn't belong to me. No evidence that anyone had been there except for the photograph in my shaking hand, which they bagged and tagged with the kind of careful professionalism that suggested they were humoring me more than anything else. "We'll look into it," the female officer said when they were done, "but without more evidence, there's not much we can do. You might want to consider staying somewhere else for a few days. Maybe get your locks changed. Get my locks changed. Like that would help. Like whatever was getting into my apartment was using a key and walking through the door like a normal person." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just nodded and watched them leave, their radios crackling as they walked down the hallway, already moving on to the next call. I didn't stay in the apartment that night. I couldn't. I packed a bag with shaking hands, stuffing in clothes and toiletries without really seeing what I was grabbing, and I drove to a motel on the other side of the city. It was a cheap place, the kind with stained carpets and a front desk clerk who didn't ask questions, but it had locks on the doors and it wasn't my apartment, and that was enough. I lay on the unfamiliar bed and stared at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the traffic outside and the distant sounds of other guests moving through the hallway. I told myself I was safe here, that whoever had been in my apartment didn't know where I'd gone, that in the morning I'd figure out what to do next, find a new place to live, maybe leave Seattle altogether, start over somewhere they couldn't find me. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself, because tucked into the front pocket of my hastily packed bag in between my toothbrush and a pair of socks was something that hadn't been there when I'd started packing. A cork coaster, the same one from my desk, placed neatly on top of my clothes like someone had slipped it in while I wasn't looking. They knew. They always knew. I left Seattle 3 days later, packed everything I could fit into my car, broke my lease without giving notice, and drove south until I hit Portland. Then I kept going. California, Arizona. I told myself I was just taking a trip, clearing my head, figuring out my next move. But the truth was, I was running, and I didn't know how to stop. My sister let me stay with her for a few weeks. She lived in a suburb outside of Denver, a quiet neighborhood with good schools and neighbors who waved from their driveways. Her husband was understanding, or at least he pretended to be, and they set me up in their guest room with fresh sheets and a lock on the door. I slept with the lights on every night. I checked the closet before bed, checked under the bed, checked the windows. My sister didn't say anything about it, but I caught her watching me sometimes, this worried crease between her eyebrows that made me feel worse instead of better. For the first few days, nothing happened. No moved objects, no unexplained footprints, no photographs left beside my bed like love letters from a nightmare. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped, that whatever had been happening in Seattle was tied to that apartment, that building, that specific place. Maybe they couldn't follow me. Maybe distance really did make a difference. Then I found the note. It was in my jacket pocket, the same jacket I'd been wearing the night I fled my apartment. I'd washed it twice since then, had gone through the pockets both times to make sure nothing was left inside. But when I reached in to grab my phone one morning, my fingers touched paper, folded paper, crisp and neat, tucked into the inner pocket like it had always been there. I stood in my sister's kitchen with the morning light streaming through the windows and the sound of her kids eating breakfast in the next room, and I unfolded the note with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The message was typed, not handwritten, clean black letters on plain white paper, just 3 words. We see you. I don't remember what happened after that. My sister told me later that I dropped the note and walked out of the house without saying anything. That I drove away before she could stop me. That she called me 17 times before I finally picked up. I don't remember any of it. The next thing I knew, I was parked in the lot of a gas station 40 miles outside of Denver, my phone buzzing in the passenger seat, my hands still gripping the steering wheel like I was afraid I'd fly apart if I let go. I couldn't go back to my sister's house, couldn't put her family at risk, couldn't drag them into whatever this was. I found an apartment in a different city, I won't say which one, and I paid 3 months up front in cash. New locks, new security system, cameras on every door and window, the kind that upload directly to the cloud so nothing can be erased or tampered with. I told myself it was enough. Told myself I'd finally taken the right precautions. For 6 months, nothing happened. I started freelancing again, slowly rebuilding the career I'd abandoned when I ran. I made a few friends, tentative connections with people who didn't know anything about my past. I started sleeping through the night, sometimes without the lights on. I started to believe, against all evidence, that I might actually be okay. Then I came home one evening and found a single muddy footprint in the middle of my kitchen floor. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Left foot, work boot, size 10 or 11. Pointing toward the door, the same print, or so close to the same that the difference didn't matter. They'd found me. They'd always been going to find me. I'd been fooling myself to think otherwise. I cleaned up the footprint, checked every room, every closet, every shadow where someone might hide. Found nothing, same as always. Then I sat down on my couch and stared at the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. I could run again, pack up and leave, find another city, another apartment, another temporary life. But what was the point? They'd found me in Seattle. They'd found me in Denver. They'd found me here. Wherever I went, they would follow. Whatever I did, they would know. So I stopped running. I still live in that apartment. It's been almost 2 years now, and they're still here. Still coming and going as they please. Still moving things just enough to let me know they visited. Still leaving their little messages where I'll be sure to find them. A coaster on my nightstand. A photograph tucked into a library book I borrowed. A note in my mailbox, typed on that same plain white paper. Still watching. They never take anything. Never hurt me. Never make themselves known in any way I can prove to anyone else. I've stopped telling people about it. Stopped trying to explain or ask for help. The police can't do anything. The cameras never catch them. The locks don't keep them out. Whatever they are, whoever they are, they exist in some space adjacent to normal life, some crack in reality that I can't close and can't escape. All I can do is live with it. All I can do is accept that I am never, ever truly alone. Some nights, I still wake up at 3 a.m. with that feeling, that absolute certainty that someone is in the room with me, standing in the dark, watching me sleep. I don't turn on the lights anymore. I don't check the closet or look under the bed. I just lie there, eyes closed, breathing slow, and wait for the feeling to pass. Sometimes it takes minutes, sometimes hours, but eventually it always fades, and I'm left alone again in the silence. Or at least, I'm left with the appearance of being alone. I've learned there's a difference. I don't know why they chose me. I don't know what they want, or when they'll decide that watching isn't enough anymore. I've stopped trying to understand. Some questions don't have answers, and some horrors don't have explanations. They're just there, part of the fabric of the world, waiting for someone to notice them. And once you do notice, once they know that you know, there's no going back, there's no forgetting, there's no escape. There's just the footprint, the note, the photograph, and the certainty that somewhere, always, they're still watching. Story 2. My email received a message time-stamped tomorrow. I've always been the kind of person who checks their email obsessively. It's a nervous habit, something I do when I'm bored or anxious, or just trying to avoid whatever task I'm supposed to be working on. Refresh, scroll, refresh again. Most of the time there's nothing new, just newsletters I never unsubscribe from and spam that slips past the filters. But that compulsive checking is how I noticed the timestamp. Anyone else might have missed it. Anyone else might have just read the message and moved on without looking at the date. I wish I'd been anyone else. It was a Wednesday evening in early March, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, half watching the rain streak down the window while I procrastinated on a project that was due the next morning. I worked as a technical writer for a software company, the kind of job that sounds impressive until you realize it mostly involves translating engineer speak into something human beings can actually understand. It paid well enough, but the deadlines were relentless, and I'd developed a bad habit of leaving things until the last minute and then panicking my way through the night. My inbox refreshed automatically, and a new message appeared at the top of the list. No subject line. The sender was a string of random characters, something like xk7m2r9 at proxy-mail.net, the kind of address that usually means spam or phishing. I should have deleted it without opening it. That's what any sensible person would do. But something about it caught my attention, some flicker of curiosity or maybe just the desperate need for distraction from the work I was avoiding. I clicked on it. The message itself was simple. Just one line of text, no signature, no formatting. Don't go to work tomorrow. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out what it meant. It read like a threat, or maybe a warning, but it was so vague that it could have been anything. A wrong number, essentially. Some message meant for someone else that had ended up in my inbox by mistake. I was about to delete it and move on when I noticed the timestamp. March 7th, 2024, 3:47 p.m. I checked the date on my laptop, March 6th, 2024, 9:23 p.m. The email was timestamped almost 18 hours in the future. My first thought was that it was a glitch. Email servers mess up timestamps all the time, time zone errors, syncing issues, whatever. I'd seen it happen before, emails showing up with dates from years ago or times that didn't make sense. It was annoying, but it wasn't supernatural. There was always an explanation. But something about this felt different. The date wasn't years off or obviously wrong. It was tomorrow, specifically tomorrow afternoon, a precise time that hadn't happened yet. And the message itself, "Don't go to work tomorrow," felt less like spam and more like someone was trying to tell me something. Someone who knew who I was, where I worked, what I'd be doing the next day. I told myself I was being paranoid, closed the laptop, made myself a cup of tea, tried to focus on my project. But I kept thinking about that email, that impossible timestamp, those 4 simple words. Don't go to work tomorrow. What did it mean? Who had sent it? And how had they sent it from a time that didn't exist yet? I didn't sleep well that night. Kept waking up every few hours, my mind cycling through explanations that all felt inadequate. By the time my alarm went off at 7, I was exhausted and irritable and no closer to understanding what had happened. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to decide what to do. The rational thing was to ignore it. Go to work, do my job. Forget about the weird email with the glitched timestamp. That's what a normal person would do. That's what I should have done. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The message had been so specific. Not "don't go outside" or "be careful" or any of the vague warnings you might expect from spam. Don't go to work tomorrow. Like whoever sent it knew exactly what I was planning to do and wanted to stop me. I called in sick. Told my manager I had a migraine, which wasn't entirely a lie. My head was pounding from the lack of sleep, and the thought of sitting in my fluorescent-lit office for 8 hours made me want to crawl back into bed and never come out. She told me to feel better and reminded me about the project deadline, and I promised I'd have it done by end of day. Then I hung up and sat in my quiet apartment, listening to the rain that had continued through the night, wondering if I'd just made a very stupid decision or a very smart one. At 3:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a breaking news alert. I picked it up without thinking, the way you do when your phone makes a sound, and read the headline. Then I read it again, because the first time the words didn't seem to connect to anything real. There had been a shooting at my office building, multiple casualties. The suspect was still at large. Police were advising everyone in the area to shelter in place. I sat there on my couch with my phone in my hand, reading those words over and over, and I couldn't breathe. My office, my building, the place I would have been sitting at 3:47 p.m. if I hadn't called in sick. The place I would have been if I hadn't gotten an impossible email telling me not to go. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I pulled up my email, scrolled to the message from the night before, and looked at the timestamp again. March 7th, 2024, 3:47 p.m. The exact minute the shooting had started. Whoever had sent that email hadn't just known something was going to happen. They'd known exactly when, and they'd warned me. They'd saved my life. I should have felt grateful. I should have felt relieved. But all I felt was a cold, creeping dread settling into the pit of my stomach. Because if someone could send an email from tomorrow, if someone could know about a tragedy before it happened, what else did they know? And why had they chosen to warn me? The next few days passed in a blur of news coverage and grief and questions I couldn't answer. 3 people died in the shooting. 2 of them co-workers I'd known for years, people I'd eaten lunch with and complained about deadlines with and never thought of as anything other than permanent fixtures in my life. The shooter was a former employee, someone who'd been let go 6 months earlier and had apparently been planning this ever since. They caught him that same evening, found him sitting in his car in a parking garage 2 miles away, the gun still in his lap. He didn't resist, didn't say anything, just let them put the cuffs on and take him away. The company gave everyone the rest of the week off. Grief counseling was available, they said. Take all the time you need. I spent those days in my apartment, unable to work, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about the email. I must have read it 100 times, staring at that timestamp like it might suddenly change, like it might reveal some explanation I'd missed. But it stayed the same. March 7th, 2024, 3:47 p.m. An impossible date from an impossible sender, warning me about something that shouldn't have been possible to know. I thought about going to the police, telling them about the email, showing them the evidence, letting them figure out what it meant. But every time I imagined that conversation, I heard how crazy it would sound. Someone sent me an email from the future telling me not to go to work, and that's why I wasn't there when the shooting happened. They'd think I was involved somehow. They'd think I knew in advance, that I was connected to the shooter, that I was covering something up. Or they'd think I was having a breakdown, that the trauma had scrambled my brain, and I was inventing stories to cope. Either way, nothing good would come from telling anyone, so I kept it to myself, deleted the email, or tried to, anyway. It disappeared from my inbox, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there somewhere, stored on some server, waiting to be found. I went back to work the following Monday, sat at my desk in the half-empty office, and tried to pretend that everything was normal, that I was normal, that I hadn't been saved by something I couldn't explain and didn't understand. 2 weeks later, another email arrived. I almost missed it. I'd trained myself to stop checking my inbox so obsessively, to let messages pile up and deal with them in batches instead of refreshing every 5 minutes. But old habits die hard, and I was in the middle of a particularly tedious document when I caught myself clicking over to my email out of pure muscle memory. The new message was sitting at the top of my inbox from the same random string of characters with the same empty subject line. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Your mother will call at 6:15. Answer. I looked at the timestamp, March 22nd, 2024, 7:03 p.m. It was currently March 21st, 4:47 p.m. The email had been sent from tomorrow evening, more than 26 hours in the future. My first instinct was to delete it, to close my laptop and walk away and pretend I'd never seen it. The first email had been terrifying enough. I didn't want to know what else this person, this thing, whatever it was, had to tell me. I didn't want to be pulled deeper into something I couldn't control. But the message mentioned my mother. And suddenly, it wasn't just about me anymore. My mom and I talked every few weeks, usually on Sundays. She lived in Wisconsin, where I'd grown up, and she was healthy for her age, active, the kind of 72-year-old who did water aerobics 3 times a week and volunteered at the library on Saturdays. We weren't especially close. There was too much history between us, too many old arguments that had never quite healed. But we loved each other in that complicated, distant way that families sometimes do. The thought of something happening to her made my chest feel tight. I saved the email this time. Took a screenshot too, just in case. Then I spent the rest of the evening trying to work, trying to watch TV, trying to do anything except stare at the clock and wait for 6:15 to arrive. The next day crawled by. I went to work, sat through meetings, pretended to be present while my mind spun in useless circles. By the time I got home, it was almost 6, and I was so tense that I jumped when my refrigerator made its normal humming sound. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, watching the minutes tick by. 6:10, 6:12, 6:14. At 6:15 exactly, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I answered before it could ring twice. "Mom? Are you okay?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that meant she was surprised by my tone. "I'm fine, honey. Why wouldn't I be? I just called to chat." I didn't know what to say. I'd been bracing for bad news, an accident, an illness, some terrible thing that the email had been warning me about. But she sounded fine. Normal. Just my mother calling to check in, the way she did every few weeks. I had a feeling. I don't know. It's nothing. How are you? We talked for an hour. She told me about her water aerobics class and the new mystery novel she was reading and the neighbor's dog that kept getting into her garden. It was mundane, pleasant, the kind of conversation we'd had 100 times before. By the time we hung up, I'd almost convinced myself that the email was meaningless, a coincidence. My mother called sometimes. The email had just happened to guess the right time. It didn't mean anything. But then I checked my inbox and there was another message waiting. Same sender, same empty subject line, time-stamped March 23rd, 11:42 a.m. tomorrow morning. She didn't tell you about the diagnosis. Ask her. The phone was still warm in my hand from the call. I stared at the screen, at those 8 words, and I felt something cold crawl down my spine. Because my mother had seemed fine, had sounded fine, but the email was telling me she wasn't. And so far, the emails hadn't been wrong. I called my mother back the next morning. My hands were shaking as I dialed, and I had to take 3 deep breaths before I could make myself press the call button. She picked up on the 4th ring, sounding surprised to hear from me again so soon. We weren't the kind of family that called 2 days in a row. "Honey, is everything okay?" "I need to ask you something," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "And I need you to tell me the truth." Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. "Mom," I said, "is there something you're not telling me? Something about your health?" The silence stretched longer. I could hear her breathing, could almost hear her deciding whether to lie. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "How did you know?" It was pancreatic cancer, stage 3. She'd found out 6 weeks ago, had been going to appointments and consultations and scans without telling anyone, trying to figure out how to break the news. She hadn't wanted to worry me, she said. Hadn't wanted to burden me with something I couldn't fix. She'd been planning to tell me when she had a better sense of the prognosis, when she knew what she was dealing with. But the prognosis wasn't good. The doctors were talking about treatment options, but their voices had that careful, measured quality that meant they were managing expectations rather than offering hope. I don't remember much of the rest of that conversation. I remember crying. I remember her crying too, both of us trying to comfort each other through the phone. Separated by 1,000 miles and decades of distance, we'd never quite figured out how to close. I remember promising to fly out that weekend, to be there for her appointments, to help however I could. And I remember, underneath all the grief and fear, a small, cold voice in the back of my mind asking, how did they know? The emails had saved my life. The emails had told me about my mother's call and her diagnosis. Whoever was sending them knew things that hadn't happened yet, things that were impossible to know, and I still had no idea why. After I hung up with my mother, I checked my inbox. There was a new message waiting, sent from later that same afternoon. Book the 2:15 flight on Saturday, not the 11:30. I stared at it for a long time. The message was mundane compared to the others. No life or death warning, no devastating revelation, just travel advice. But something about its specificity unsettled me even more than the previous emails had. Whoever was sending these wasn't just predicting major events. They were tracking the small details of my life, the decisions I hadn't even made yet, guiding me toward outcomes I couldn't see. I booked the 2:15 flight. What else was I supposed to do? The emails had been right about everything so far. If they said to take the later flight, there had to be a reason. That Saturday, the 11:30 flight to Milwaukee was delayed on the tarmac for 4 hours due to a mechanical issue. Passengers were stuck on the plane with no air conditioning, no food, no way to get off. I read about it on my phone while I sat at my gate, waiting for the 2:15 boarding call, and I felt that cold crawl down my spine again. They'd known. They'd known about a mechanical problem that hadn't happened yet, and they'd steered me away from it. Part of me wanted to feel grateful. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they seemed to be helping me, protecting me. But gratitude wasn't what I felt. What I felt was watched, monitored. Like every move I made was being observed by something I couldn't see, something that knew my future better than I did and was nudging me along a path I hadn't chosen. The emails kept coming, not every day. Sometimes a week would pass without anything, but often enough that I started expecting them, checking for them. They told me which route to take to work when there was going to be an accident on my usual commute. They told me to leave a meeting early, and 20 minutes later, a pipe burst in the conference room and flooded the whole floor. They told me not to eat at a restaurant I'd been planning to try, and the next week I saw on the news that it had been shut down for health code violations. Small things, mostly. Inconveniences avoided, minor disasters sidestepped. But each one reminded me that I wasn't in control, that someone else was pulling the strings, keeping me safe in ways I hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. Then, about 2 months after the first email, the messages started to change. It began subtly, an email telling me to cancel plans with a friend I'd known since college. Don't go to dinner with Marcus on Friday. Stay home. I ignored it. Marcus was one of my closest friends, someone I trusted completely, and I couldn't think of any reason to avoid him. We had dinner. Nothing bad happened. I went home that night feeling triumphant, like I'd finally broken free of whatever hold the emails had on me. The next morning, there was a message waiting, time-stamped from that evening, hours in the future. We warned you, now watch. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know what I was supposed to be watching for, but the tone was different, not helpful anymore, not protective. There was something cold in those words, something that felt like a threat. That evening, Marcus called to tell me he'd been in a car accident. He was okay, shaken up, a few bruises, but nothing serious. Another driver had run a red light and clipped his bumper, sending him spinning into a guardrail. He'd been on his way home from the gym, a route he drove every day, and he couldn't understand how it had happened. "I'm fine," he kept saying. "I'm fine. I'm just rattled." But I heard what he wasn't saying. I heard the fear underneath the reassurance, and I thought about the email. We warned you. Now watch. Had they caused the accident? Was that even possible? Or had they simply known it was going to happen and let it play out because I hadn't listened? I didn't know. But I was starting to understand something I should have realized from the beginning. The emails weren't trying to help me. They were trying to control me, and when I didn't do what they said, there were consequences. I tried to stop reading them. For almost a week, I didn't open my email at all. Let the messages pile up, hundreds of them. Work emails, spam, newsletters, and somewhere in there, the ones with the random sender address and the empty subject lines. I told myself that if I didn't read them, they couldn't control me. That ignorance was a kind of freedom, even if it was the coward's way out. But the problem with ignoring the future is that the future happens anyway. On the 4th day of my email blackout, my apartment flooded. A pipe burst in the wall sometime during the night, and I woke up to 3 inches of water covering my bedroom floor, soaking into everything I owned. The damage was catastrophic. My laptop destroyed, most of my clothes ruined, the hardwood floors warped beyond repair. I had to move into a hotel while the landlord dealt with the repairs, had to replace almost everything I owned, had to spend hours on the phone with insurance companies who seemed determined to pay out as little as possible. When I finally broke down and checked my email from my new phone, there was a message waiting from 5 days earlier, time-stamped the morning before the flood. Turn off the water main before you go to sleep tonight. They'd warned me. They'd given me a way to prevent it, and I'd chosen not to look. The flood wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was a lesson. After that, I read every email the moment it arrived. The requests got stranger, more personal. They told me to end things with a guy I'd been seeing casually for a few weeks, someone I genuinely liked, someone who made me laugh for the first time since the shooting. Break up with Daniel before Thursday, the email said. I didn't want to. I called him anyway, made up some excuse about not being ready for a relationship, listened to the confusion in his voice as he tried to understand what had changed. I hated myself for it. But I was too scared of what would happen if I didn't obey. They told me to quit my job, to apply for a position at a different company, one I'd never heard of, in a department I wasn't qualified for. Send your resume to this address by 5 p.m. Friday. You'll get the job. I did it. I got the interview, got the offer, gave my notice at work. My coworkers thought I was crazy, leaving a stable position for something unknown, especially after everything that had happened. I couldn't explain. I couldn't tell them that I didn't have a choice, that someone else was making my decisions for me now. The new job was fine. Better than fine, actually. The pay was higher, the hours were more flexible, and my manager was the kind of person who actually listened when you talked. But I couldn't enjoy any of it. Every good thing that happened felt like a reward for obedience, a treat given to a dog that had performed the right trick. I wasn't living my life anymore. I was following a script someone else had written. 3 months into the new job, my mother passed away. The cancer had spread faster than the doctors expected, and by the end, she was barely conscious, drifting in and out of a morphine haze that kept the pain at bay but stole whatever time we had left together. I flew out for the funeral, sat in the front pew of the church where I'd been baptized as a baby, and listened to people talk about a woman they thought they knew. I didn't cry. I felt hollowed out, empty, like the grief had carved out everything inside me and left nothing but a shell. The night after the funeral, alone in my childhood bedroom, I checked my email for the first time in days. There were 2 messages waiting. The first was time-stamped from earlier that day, around the time of the service. We're sorry for your loss. She lived 3 months longer because you listened. I read that sentence over and over, trying to understand what it meant. 3 months longer, because I listened. Were they saying that my obedience had bought her time? That if I'd ignored the emails, if I'd fought back, she would have died sooner? I didn't know if it was true. I didn't know if anything they told me was true. But the implication was clear. My compliance had value. My mother's life had been the reward. The second email was time-stamped from the next morning. Tomorrow. Go to the address below at 8 p.m. Come alone. Don't tell anyone. Below the text was a street address I didn't recognize, somewhere on the outskirts of the city I now lived in. No explanation. No context. Just a command, delivered with the same cold certainty as everything else they'd ever sent me. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, in the room where I'd grown up, surrounded by faded posters and dusty trophies from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The rain had started outside, tapping against the window in that familiar rhythm that used to comfort me as a child. Now it just sounded like fingers drumming impatiently, waiting for me to make a decision. Every email before this had been about avoiding danger, protecting myself, protecting others, staying safe. But this was different. This wasn't a warning. It was a summons. They weren't telling me what to avoid. They were telling me where to go, and they didn't want anyone to know. I thought about all the times I'd obeyed, the flight I'd taken, the dinner I'd canceled, the job I'd quit. Each time, I told myself I was being smart, being careful, staying alive. But I'd also been giving them more power, showing them that I could be controlled, that I would do whatever they asked as long as they framed it as protection. And now they weren't framing it anymore. Now they were just telling me what to do and expecting me to comply. I could refuse. I could delete the email, ignore the address, go back to my life and pretend I'd never seen it. But I thought about my apartment flooding. I thought about Marcus's car accident. I thought about my mother dying 3 months later than she should have because I'd played along. What would they take from me if I said no? The question sat in my stomach like a stone. I already knew the answer. I'd known it from the moment I'd gotten the first email, the one that saved my life. There was no refusing. There was no escape. There was only the path they'd chosen for me, stretching out into a future I couldn't see, leading somewhere I couldn't imagine. I copied the address into my phone, deleted the email, and started packing my bags. Whatever was waiting for me, I was going to find out. The address led to an industrial area on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that's all chain-link fences and unmarked buildings and parking lots full of shipping containers. I'd never been there before, had no reason to know it existed. The GPS guided me down increasingly narrow streets until I reached a squat brick building with no signage, no windows on the ground floor, nothing to indicate what it was or who used it. There was a single metal door on the side, illuminated by a security light that flickered every few seconds like it was struggling to stay alive. It was 7:58 p.m. The rain had followed me from Wisconsin, a light drizzle that turned the pavement slick and reflective. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, to go home, to pretend I'd never seen that email. But I'd tried ignoring them before. I'd seen what happened when I didn't comply. At exactly 8 p.m., I got out of the car and walked to the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into a hallway lit by fluorescent tubes, the kind that hum at a frequency just low enough to make you feel uneasy. The walls were bare concrete, the floor industrial tile worn smooth by years of foot traffic. There were no signs, no directions, nothing to indicate where I was supposed to go. But at the end of the hallway, maybe 50 feet away, there was another door, this one slightly ajar with light spilling through the gap. I walked toward it. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, and with each step, the humming of the lights seemed to grow louder, more insistent. By the time I reached the door, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I pushed it open and stepped through. The room beyond was small and sparse. A table in the center, 2 chairs on opposite sides, a single lamp casting a pool of warm light that didn't reach the corners. The walls were the same bare concrete as the hallway, and there were no windows, no other doors, no way out except the way I'd come in. It felt like an interrogation room or a cell. There was a woman sitting in one of the chairs. She looked ordinary, middle-aged, maybe early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a face that was neither pretty nor plain, just unremarkable in a way that made it hard to focus on. She was wearing a dark sweater and jeans, no jewelry, no makeup, nothing that stood out. She could have been anyone, a librarian, a school teacher, someone's mother. She looked up when I entered, and her expression was calm, almost kind. "Please," she said, "sit down." I sat. What else was I supposed to do? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me with eyes that were pale and steady, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing things about me that I didn't know myself. Finally, she folded her hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "You have questions," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Why have you been sending me those emails? How do you know what's going to happen?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Those aren't the right questions. You already know the answers wouldn't satisfy you. There's no explanation I could give that would make any of this make sense, not in the way you want it to. Then why am I here? Because it's time for you to understand what's expected of you." She unfolded her hands and reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small envelope that she slid across the table toward me. "You've been chosen, not randomly. Nothing is random. Every moment of your life has led to this point. The shooting, your mother, the choices you've made and the ones you've avoided. All of it was preparation." I didn't touch the envelope. I couldn't make myself move. Preparation for what? For the work. She nodded toward the envelope. "Inside, you'll find instructions for the next phase. Someone else's life is about to change the way yours did. Someone who needs guidance. Someone who needs to be protected, shaped, directed toward the path they're meant to walk. That's your responsibility now." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You want me to send the emails. You want me to control someone else the way you controlled me. We don't control anyone. We guide. We protect. We prevent disasters and nudge people toward outcomes that serve a greater purpose. The person you'll be watching over. They're important. More important than you know. And without your help, they won't survive what's coming." "What if I refuse?" The smile faded. For the first time, something cold flickered behind those pale eyes, something ancient and implacable. "You've seen what happens when people refuse. You've felt it. The flood, your friend's accident, the time your mother had left." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We don't punish disobedience. We simply stop protecting. And without protection, the world is a very dangerous place." She stood up, pushing her chair back with a scrape that echoed in the small room. "Take the envelope. Go home. Read the instructions. In 3 days, you'll receive your first message to deliver. After that, it gets easier. You'll see patterns, connections, the shape of things that haven't happened yet. It becomes natural, eventually, almost like instinct." She walked past me toward the door, and I didn't try to stop her. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except sit there in that cold little room with the envelope on the table in front of me. At the door, she paused and looked back. "You were saved for a reason. Everyone who does this work was saved for a reason. Try to remember that when it gets hard. Try to remember that you're part of something larger than yourself." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving me alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the envelope I didn't want to open. I sat there for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe more. The lamp flickered once, twice, and I watched the shadows dance across the concrete walls, thinking about everything that had led me to this moment. The email that saved my life, the warnings I'd obeyed and the ones I'd ignored. My mother living 3 months longer because I'd done what I was told. The shape of my life, bent and twisted into something I didn't recognize, all in service of a purpose I still didn't understand. Eventually, I reached for the envelope, opened it, read the single sheet of paper inside, a name, an email address, a date, 3 days from now, and a message typed in the same clean font as every email I'd ever received from them. "Tell her not to get on the bus." I folded the paper carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I stood up, walked out of the building, and drove home through the rain. 3 days later, I sent my first email from tomorrow. I'm still sending them. I don't know how many people I've guided now. Dozens, maybe more. I don't know who else is doing this work or how many of us there are. or what greater purpose any of it serves. I just know that the messages come, and I deliver them, and somewhere out there, people are being saved, being shaped, being prepared for something they can't see yet. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing good, if the lives I'm protecting are worth the freedom I'm taking away, if the people I guide will end up in this same room someday, staring at an envelope they don't want to open. But mostly, I try not to wonder about anything at all. It's easier that way. It's easier to just do what you're told, to follow the script, to trust that someone, somewhere, knows what they're doing. The emails never stop coming, and I never stop sending them. After all, I was saved for a reason, wasn't I? Story 3, The Trail Walker Who Kept Pace Behind Me. The first time I looked back, he was maybe 200 feet behind me. Just a figure on the trail, another hiker, nothing unusual. The second time I looked back, 20 minutes later, he was still 200 feet behind me. I'd been walking faster by then, pushing myself up a steep incline that had my calves burning and my lungs working overtime. He should have fallen further back, or caught up, or done something other than maintain that exact same distance, like he was tethered to me by an invisible rope. That was when I started to get nervous. I've been hiking alone for almost 15 years. Started in my early 20s, back when I was working a soul-crushing corporate job and needed something to remind me that I was still alive, that the world was bigger than spreadsheets and conference calls and the gray walls of my cubicle. The trails became my therapy, my church, my escape from everything that felt wrong about modern life. I'd driven thousands of miles to walk hundreds more, through national parks and state forests and wilderness areas most people had never heard of. I knew how to read weather patterns and navigate by compass and treat a sprained ankle in the backcountry. I wasn't reckless, wasn't naive. I understood the risks of solo hiking better than most people, but I'd never experienced anything like this. It was late September, and I was 3 days into a 5-day trip through a stretch of the Appalachian Trail I'd been wanting to tackle for years. The weather had been perfect. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, the trees just starting to turn colors at the higher elevations. I'd seen a few other hikers during the first 2 days, exchanged the usual pleasantries, shared information about water sources and campsite conditions. Normal trail interactions, nothing that set off any alarms. I first noticed him on the morning of day 3. I'd broken camp early, wanting to cover some serious ground before the afternoon heat set in, and I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I happened to glance over my shoulder. He was there, far enough back that I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape moving through the trees at the same steady pace I was keeping. I didn't think much of it at the time. The trail was public. Other people used it. There was nothing strange about someone walking the same direction I was walking. But then I stopped to filter water at a stream crossing, and when I looked back, he had stopped too. Not at the stream. There was no stream where he was standing, just stopped, motionless on the trail, waiting. I told myself he was probably checking his map or adjusting his pack or doing any of the 100 small tasks that hikers do throughout the day. But something about the stillness of him bothered me. He wasn't moving at all. Just standing there, facing my direction, like he was watching me. I finished filtering my water faster than I should have, sloppy and rushed, and started walking again. When I looked back a few minutes later, he was moving too. Same pace, same distance, 200 feet, give or take, like I'd never stopped at all. The trail wound through dense forest for most of that morning, the trees pressing in close on either side, blocking out the sky and muffling sound in a way that made me feel isolated, even though I knew I wasn't alone. The only noises were my own footsteps, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots, and the occasional call of birds I couldn't see. I kept glancing back, kept checking, and every time, he was there. Never closer, never farther. Just that same fixed distance, that same dark shape following the path I'd already walked. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just a hiker who happened to move at the same speed I did. Maybe he was maintaining distance on purpose. giving me space, being polite in the way that solo hikers often are with each other. There were explanations. There were always explanations. But the rational part of my brain was having trouble drowning out the other part, the part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years by recognizing when something was wrong. And something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, that low-level hum of unease that wouldn't go away no matter how many times I told myself I was overreacting. Around midday, I decided to test it. I picked up my pace significantly, pushing into a near jog that sent my heart rate spiking and sweat streaming down my face. I kept it up for 10 minutes, 15, until my lungs were burning and my legs were screaming at me to stop. Then I turned around, half expecting to see the trail empty behind me, half expecting to have finally put some distance between us. He was 200 feet back. Exactly 200 feet, as if the distance had been measured with a surveyor's tape. And he wasn't breathing hard, wasn't bent over catching his breath, wasn't showing any sign that he'd just matched my sprint through the forest. He was just standing there, the same way he'd been standing all morning, that dark, motionless shape that I still couldn't quite bring into focus, no matter how hard I squinted. That was when the fear really set in. Not nervousness anymore, not unease, fear, cold and sharp, like ice water flooding my veins, because what I'd just done was impossible to match by accident. No one could maintain that exact distance through a sudden acceleration without running themselves. No one could stop the moment I stopped and stand there like they hadn't just sprinted a quarter mile through rough terrain, unless they weren't following me at all, unless they were something else entirely. I turned and kept walking, faster now, my mind racing through options. The next shelter was still 8 miles away. I had a knife in my pack, bear spray on my hip, a whistle around my neck. None of it felt like enough. None of it felt like protection against whatever was behind me, maintaining its perfect distance, matching my every move like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. The clouds were rolling in from the west, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. By evening, the forest would be dripping and gray, visibility cut to almost nothing. And I would still be out here, alone on this trail, with something 200 feet behind me that I couldn't outrun and couldn't understand. I didn't look back again for a long time after that. I was too afraid of what I might see. The rain started around 3 in the afternoon, a light drizzle at first that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Within 20 minutes, I was soaked through despite my rain gear, water running down my face and pooling in my boots with every step. The trail turned to mud beneath my feet, slick and treacherous, and I had to slow my pace to avoid twisting an ankle or sliding down one of the steeper sections. The forest had gone dark and gray around me, the trees pressing in closer than ever, their branches heavy with water that dripped onto my head and shoulders like cold fingers tapping for attention. I hadn't looked back in over an hour, didn't want to, didn't need to. I could feel him there, that presence behind me, maintaining his distance with mechanical precision. The rain should have made it harder to keep pace, should have slowed him down the way it was slowing me down, but I knew without checking that it hadn't. 200 feet, always 200 feet. The number had taken on an almost mystical significance in my mind, like a curse or a prophecy. Around 4 o'clock, I came across another hiker heading in the opposite direction. She emerged from the gray curtain of rain like an apparition, a woman in her 40s with a bright orange pack cover and a determined expression that suggested she'd been dealing with this weather for hours. We both stopped when we saw each other, the way hikers do, and I felt a surge of something like hope flood through my chest. Another person, a witness, proof that I wasn't alone out here with whatever was following me. "Hell of a day for it," she said, wiping water from her face. "How's the trail ahead?" "Muddy," I managed. My voice came out strange, rough and breathless. "Listen, when you were coming this way, did you pass anyone else? A man, maybe? Walking alone?" She thought about it for a moment, rain dripping off the brim of her hat. "Haven't seen anyone since this morning. Pretty quiet out here today." She paused, studying my face with a concern that told me I probably looked as scared as I felt. "You okay? You seem a little spooked." I wanted to tell her, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and explain that something was following me, something that couldn't be outrun or lost, something that maintained a perfect 200-foot distance no matter what I did. But I couldn't make the words come out. They sounded insane even in my own head. She'd think I was having a breakdown, or worse, she'd think I was dangerous. So I just shook my head and forced a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Just the weather getting to me. Be careful out there. It's slippery." She nodded and moved past me, continuing down the trail in the direction I'd come from. I watched her go, watched her bright orange pack cover disappear into the rain, and I waited, counted the seconds in my head. 30, 60, 90. If there was someone on the trail behind me, she would see him. She would have to pass right by him. And then I'd know. Then I'd have confirmation that he was real, that I wasn't losing my mind out here in the wet and the dark. I waited until I couldn't see her anymore, until she'd been swallowed completely by the gray, and then I turned around and looked. He was still there, 200 feet back, standing motionless in the rain, that dark shape that refused to resolve into anything recognizable no matter how hard I stared. The woman should have passed him by now, should have walked right past him on this narrow trail where there was barely room for two people to squeeze by each other. But she hadn't said anything, hadn't reacted, hadn't given any indication that she'd seen anyone at all. Because she hadn't. Because whatever was behind me, she couldn't see it. I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet, a wave of dizziness washing over me that had nothing to do with exhaustion or hunger. She hadn't seen him. A living, breathing person had walked right past where he was standing, and she'd told me the trail was empty. That meant one of two things. Either I was hallucinating, conjuring phantoms out of rain and shadow and fear, or he was something that only I could see. Something that existed only for me. Neither option made me feel any better. I started walking again, faster now, pushing through the mud and the rain with a desperation that made my muscles burn. The trail climbed steadily upward, switchbacking through the forest toward a ridge that would give me a view of the surrounding terrain. Maybe from higher ground, I could see something useful. A road, a campsite, other hikers who could help. Anything that might break this nightmare I'd stumbled into. The climb took almost an hour. By the time I reached the ridge, the rain had slowed to a drizzle again, and the clouds had lifted just enough to let some weak gray light filter through. I stood at the top, gasping for breath, my legs trembling with exhaustion, and looked back down the trail I'd just climbed. He was at the bottom, 200 feet down the slope, standing at the first switchback, as motionless as a statue. From this angle, this height, I could see him more clearly than I had all day. He was tall, taller than I'd realized, with proportions that seemed slightly wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too narrow, a head that sat at an angle that no human neck should allow. He was wearing dark clothes, or what looked like dark clothes, but the more I stared, the more I realized I couldn't actually make out any details. No face, no features, no distinguishing marks of any kind. Just a shape, a silhouette, a hole in the world where a person should be. I don't know how long I stood there looking at him. Long enough for my breathing to slow. Long enough for the fear to settle into something colder and heavier. Something that felt less like panic and more like despair. Because I understood now. I understood that whatever he wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to get bored or give up or decide I wasn't worth following anymore. He was going to stay 200 feet behind me until something changed. Until I did something different. I just didn't know what that something was. The ridge trail stretched out ahead of me, winding along the spine of the mountain toward the shelter that was still 5 miles away. 5 miles of exposed terrain, rocky footing, limited cover, and behind me, always behind me, that dark shape waiting to match my pace. I started walking. There was nothing else I could do. The sun set somewhere behind the clouds around 6:30, and the world went from gray to dark in what felt like minutes. I'd been pushing hard all afternoon, ignoring the protests from my legs and back, trying to cover as much ground as possible before I lost the light completely. The shelter should have been close by then, maybe a mile, maybe less, but the darkness made everything harder. The trail became a narrow ribbon of slightly less dark ground winding through absolute blackness, and every step felt like a gamble. I turned on my headlamp and kept moving. The beam cut a weak cone of light through the night, illuminating wet rocks and muddy trail and the ghostly shapes of trees crowding in from either side. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the canopy above, pattering against my hood and shoulders in an irregular rhythm that kept me on edge. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness: the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the forest, and underneath it all, the soft crunch of footsteps that weren't mine. I could hear him now. That was new. All day he'd been silent, a visual presence without any auditory component, but now I could hear the rhythm of his steps behind me, perfectly synchronized with my own. When I walked, he walked. When I stopped, he stopped. The sound came from exactly where I expected it to come from, 200 feet back, that unchanging distance. But hearing it made everything worse, made it more real, made it impossible to pretend anymore that this was all in my head. The shelter materialized out of the darkness around 7:15. It was one of those three-sided wooden structures the trail maintains every few miles, just a roof and a platform and walls on three sides to keep out the worst of the weather. In daylight, it would have looked rustic and welcoming. In the beam of my headlamp, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt solid, it looked like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I climbed onto the platform and dropped my pack with a thud that echoed in the enclosed space. My hands were shaking as I unclipped my sleeping bag, my body running on fumes and adrenaline and a fear so constant it had almost become background noise. I needed to eat, needed to rest, needed to close my eyes for a few hours and hope that morning would bring some kind of solution. But first, I had to know. I turned and pointed my headlamp back down the trail. He was there. Of course he was there. Standing at the edge of the light, just beyond where the beam could fully illuminate him, 200 feet from the shelter platform. I could see the outline of his shape, that wrong silhouette, those two long arms hanging at his sides, but his face, if he had a face, remained lost in shadow. He wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound now that I'd stopped walking, just standing there, patient and still, like he could wait forever. "What do you want?" I heard myself say. The words came out cracked and desperate, barely louder than a whisper. "What do you want from me?" No response, no movement, just that terrible stillness, that sense of being watched by something that didn't need to blink or breathe or shift its weight from foot to foot. I stood there with my headlamp pointed at him, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to move or speak or disappear. But nothing changed. He was as constant as a law of physics, as inevitable as gravity. Eventually, I turned away. I couldn't stand there all night. Couldn't keep staring into that darkness, hoping for answers that weren't going to come. I ate a protein bar without tasting it, drank water from my filter bottle, and crawled into my sleeping bag with my knife in one hand and my bear spray in the other. The shelter felt too exposed, too open on one side, but it was better than nothing. Better than sleeping on the trail with him standing over me. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion has a way of overriding fear. I drifted off sometime around midnight, my body finally shutting down despite the protests of my racing mind. I woke up because the distance had changed. I don't know how I knew. Some instinct, some primitive alarm system buried deep in my brainstem that recognized when something fundamental had shifted. My eyes snapped open, and I was immediately, completely awake, every nerve ending firing at once. The shelter was pitch black. My headlamp had died or turned off, I couldn't tell which, and I couldn't see anything. But I could feel it. Could feel him closer than before, close enough that the air itself seemed to compress around me. I fumbled for my headlamp, found the switch, pressed it. Nothing. Dead batteries, or something worse. something that had drained the power while I slept. I grabbed my phone instead, hit the flashlight button, and swept the beam across the shelter. He was standing at the edge of the platform, 10 feet away, maybe less. I screamed. Couldn't help it. The sound tore out of me before I could stop it, raw and animal, the kind of scream that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. I scrambled backward, kicking my way out of my sleeping bag, until my back hit the wooden wall of the shelter. The phone trembled in my hand, the light bouncing wildly, but I kept it pointed at him, kept my eyes locked on that shape that had spent all day 200 feet behind me and was now close enough to touch. He hadn't changed. Still that wrong silhouette, those impossible proportions, that face-shaped darkness where features should be. But being close to him was different than seeing him from a distance. I could feel something now, something that radiated off him like heat from a fire, except it wasn't heat. It was cold, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a cold that seemed to reach inside me and wrap around my spine and squeeze. "Stay back," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. "Stay away from me." He didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there at the edge of the platform, that dark shape in my phone's trembling light, and I realized with a horror that went beyond fear that he was waiting. Not attacking, not advancing, just waiting. Like he'd closed the distance while I slept to deliver a message, to prove a point, and now he was giving me time to understand. The distance could change. The rules I'd thought I understood, the fixed 200 feet, the constant separation, those weren't rules at all. They were choices. He'd been staying back because he wanted to, because he was playing with me, letting me run, letting me think I had some kind of control. And now he wanted me to know the truth. I sat there against the wall of the shelter with my phone pointed at him, not daring to look away, not daring to close my eyes. The cold radiating off him seeped into my bones, made my teeth chatter, made my whole body shake with something that wasn't quite shivering. Dawn was still hours away. The darkness outside the shelter was absolute, and he was 10 feet away, close enough that if he wanted to, he could reach me in a single step. He didn't move. Not for the rest of the night. Neither did I. We stayed like that until the first gray light of morning began to filter through the trees, and when I finally blinked and looked away for just a second, just long enough to rub my burning eyes, he was gone. The platform was empty. The forest was silent. It was like he'd never been there at all. But I knew he had, and I knew he'd be back. He was just giving me a head start. I didn't waste it. The moment there was enough light to see the trail, I was moving, shoving gear into my pack without bothering to organize it, hands still shaking from the cold that had seeped into my bones during the night. I didn't eat, didn't filter water, didn't do any of the things you're supposed to do in the morning before a long day of hiking. I just moved, pushing through the forest at a pace that was reckless and unsustainable and absolutely necessary. The trail descended from the ridge that morning, dropping down through switchbacks into a valley where a river ran shallow and clear over smooth stones. I could hear it before I could see it, that constant rushing sound that usually felt peaceful, but now just seemed like white noise, something to mask the footsteps that would inevitably start up behind me. I didn't look back, didn't want to know how much of a head start I actually had. Didn't want to see that dark shape appear between the trees when it decided the game was back on. By 9 o'clock, I'd covered almost 6 miles, which should have been impossible given the terrain and my exhaustion. Fear is a powerful fuel. It keeps you moving when your body wants to quit, keeps your legs pumping when your muscles are screaming for rest. I was running on pure adrenaline, burning through reserves I didn't know I had, and I knew I couldn't keep it up forever, but I didn't need forever. I just needed to reach the road. There was a trailhead 12 miles from the shelter, a parking area where the path crossed a rural highway. I'd passed it on my way in 3 days ago, back when this was just another hiking trip and not a desperate flight from something I couldn't name. If I could reach it, I could flag down a car, find other people, get off this trail and back to a world where things made sense. I was maybe 4 miles from the road when I finally looked back. He was there, 200 feet behind me, that familiar distance restored like nothing had changed, like he hadn't spent the night standing 10 feet away from me, radiating that impossible cold, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. He was moving again, matching my pace step for step, that dark silhouette threading through the trees with a fluidity that no human body should possess. In the daylight, I could see more details, or rather, I could see the absence of details, the way light seemed to bend around him, the way his edges blurred and shifted like heat rising off summer asphalt. I turned and kept running. The forest thinned as I descended into the valley, the trees spreading out and letting more light filter through. The trail widened, became better maintained, showed signs of more frequent use. I passed a day hiker coming the other way, a young guy in shorts and running shoes, totally unprepared for anything more than a few miles, and I grabbed his arm as he tried to pass me. "There's something on the trail," I gasped. "Behind me. Did you see it? Did you see anything?" He looked at me like I was insane, looked at my hand on his arm, at my wild eyes and sweat-soaked clothes and the desperation that must have been written all over my face. "Dude, I haven't seen anyone. Are you okay? You look like..." "You didn't see him? Tall, dark, about 200 feet back? You would have passed right by him." The guy pulled his arm free, taking a step back, putting distance between us. "There's nobody back there, man. I've been walking for an hour. It's just you." He edged around me, moving faster now, clearly eager to get away from the crazy person on the trail. "Maybe you should sit down, drink some water. You don't look so good." I let him go. What else could I do? He couldn't see it. Just like the woman yesterday, he'd walked right past it and seen nothing. Whatever was following me existed in some space that only I could perceive, some nightmare dimension that overlapped with the real world but wasn't quite part of it. The road couldn't come fast enough. I pushed harder, ignoring the cramps in my legs, ignoring the spots that were starting to dance at the edges of my vision. The trail markers counted down the distance, 3 miles to the trailhead, then 2, then 1. I could almost taste freedom, almost believe that I was going to make it, that once I stepped off this trail and onto asphalt, the thing behind me would lose its hold somehow. The parking lot appeared through the trees around 2 in the afternoon. A small gravel area with space for maybe a dozen cars, a wooden signboard with a map of the trails, a porta-potty at the far end. There were 2 vehicles parked there, a pickup truck with a kayak strapped to the roof and a sedan with out-of-state plates. Real cars, real evidence of real people who existed in the normal world. I burst out of the trees and into the lot, my boots crunching on gravel, my lungs heaving. A man was standing by the pickup truck, loading gear into the bed, and he looked up when he heard me coming. I must have looked like a wild animal, filthy, exhausted, half crazed with fear, because he took an instinctive step backward, his hand moving toward his pocket. "Help," I managed to say. "Please. There's something on the trail." And then I turned around to point, to show him what had been following me for 2 days, and I felt the words die in my throat. He was at the edge of the parking lot, not 200 feet away anymore, not at the tree line where the trail emerged from the forest. He was standing next to the sedan with the out-of-state plates, maybe 30 feet from where I was standing, close enough that I could see the way the light seemed to dim around him, like he was pulling the brightness out of the air. The man with the pickup truck was staring at me, waiting for me to finish my sentence. He couldn't see it. Of course he couldn't see it. Nobody could see it except me. I started to say, but then the thing moved. It didn't walk, didn't step toward me the way it had been stepping all along the trail. It flickered, like a frame skipping in a movie, and suddenly it was 10 feet closer. 20 feet away now. The man by the truck was saying something, asking if I needed help, but I couldn't hear him over the roaring in my ears. Another flicker. 10 feet closer. I could feel the cold now, that bone-deep chill that I remembered from the shelter, reaching out toward me across the gravel lot. I ran, Didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted for the highway. The man behind me shouted something. "Hey, wait, are you okay?" But I was already gone, my boots pounding on gravel and then on asphalt, running down the center line of the empty road with no destination in mind except away. I didn't look back. I was too afraid of how close it might be. A car found me about a mile down the road. An older couple in a minivan on their way to visit their grandchildren, who saw a filthy, wild-eyed man stumbling down the center line and pulled over to help. The woman got out first, her face creased with concern, asking if I was hurt, if I needed them to call someone. I couldn't answer, couldn't form words. I just kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the empty road behind me, waiting for that dark shape to flicker into view. They drove me to the nearest town, a small community about 20 minutes away with a general store and a volunteer fire department, and not much else. I sat in the back of their minivan with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The woman had insisted, said I was shivering so hard my teeth were chattering, and I watched the road behind us the entire time. Every shadow between the trees looked like him. Every flicker of movement made my heart lurch in my chest. But he didn't appear. The road stayed empty, the forest stayed still, and by the time we pulled into the parking lot of the fire station, I'd almost convinced myself that it was over. The paramedics who checked me out said I was severely dehydrated and showing signs of exhaustion. They wanted to take me to a hospital 2 towns over, run some tests, keep me overnight for observation. I refused. I couldn't explain why, couldn't tell them that I needed to get as far away from those woods as possible, that I was afraid of what might follow me if I stayed too close. They thought I was being difficult, the way trauma victims sometimes are, and eventually they let me sign a waiver and call a friend to pick me up. I didn't go back for my car. It was still parked at the trailhead on the other side of the forest, where I'd left it 3 days earlier at the start of my hike. I paid a service to retrieve it a week later. Couldn't make myself drive back there. Couldn't face the thought of being anywhere near those trails again. When they delivered it to my apartment, I found a parking ticket on the windshield and pine needles collected in the wheel wells, and I sat in my driveway for an hour just staring at it, remembering what it had felt like to lock the doors and shoulder my pack and walk into the forest without any idea of what was waiting for me. For a while, I thought I was safe. Weeks passed, then months. I didn't go hiking anymore. Couldn't even think about it without my chest tightening and my hands starting to shake. I saw a therapist who specialized in trauma, told her a sanitized version of what had happened, and she diagnosed me with acute stress disorder triggered by some unspecified event in the wilderness. She gave me techniques for managing the flashbacks, the nightmares, the constant feeling of being watched. They helped a little, enough to get me through the days without falling apart. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder, never stopped scanning the edges of every room, every parking lot, every sidewalk for that familiar dark shape. It became a compulsion, something I did without thinking, an unconscious check that I performed 100 times a day. Most of the time there was nothing there. Just normal people living normal lives, completely unaware of the thing that had followed me out of those woods. Most of the time. The first time I saw him again was about 6 months after the trail. I was walking home from work on a Tuesday evening, taking my usual route through a residential neighborhood where the houses had big yards and the streetlights were spaced far enough apart to leave pools of shadow between them. I'd stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, when something made me turn around. He was standing at the end of the block, 200 feet away, give or take. That same silhouette, those same wrong proportions, that same absolute stillness that no living thing should be capable of. He was just standing there on the sidewalk, not moving, not approaching, just watching me from that precise distance like we were connected by a string neither of us could break. The light changed. I walked across the street without looking back, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. When I reached the other side and finally let myself turn around, he was gone. The sidewalk was empty. The shadows held nothing but darkness. I told myself I'd imagined it, told myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my traumatized brain seeing threats where none existed. The therapist had warned me about this, about the way fear can rewire your perception, make you see danger in innocent shadows. I went home, took a sleeping pill, and spent the night convincing myself that it hadn't been real. But I saw him again 2 weeks later, and again a month after that, always at a distance, always at the edge of my perception, always gone by the time I worked up the courage to look directly at him. He appeared on street corners and in parking garages and at the far end of subway platforms, that dark shape standing motionless among crowds of people who couldn't see him. He never got closer than 200 feet, never flickered toward me the way he had in that parking lot. Just stood there, watching, reminding me that he was still out there, that he hadn't forgotten, that the game wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase. It's been 3 years now. I've moved twice, changed jobs, started dating someone who doesn't know anything about what happened to me on that trail. I've built something that looks like a normal life from the outside, complete with routines and relationships and plans for the future. Most days I can almost forget, almost convince myself that those sightings were nothing, that I've outrun whatever was following me, that I'm finally safe. Then I'll be walking down the street or sitting in a coffee shop or lying in bed next to someone I care about, and I'll feel it. That prickle at the back of my neck, that cold certainty of being watched. I'll turn around, and there he'll be, 200 feet away, standing at the edge of a crowd or in the shadow between two buildings or at the far end of an empty hallway. Still waiting, still watching, still keeping that perfect distance like he's got all the time in the world. I don't know what he wants. I don't know why he chose me, or what will happen when he decides that watching isn't enough anymore. I just know that he's patient, that he's been following me for 3 years, and he hasn't gotten bored yet, that the distance between us could change at any moment, the same way it changed in that shelter, and I would have no warning and no defense. Sometimes I wonder if I should go back to the trail, face him on his own ground, force some kind of confrontation, end this one way or another. But I know I won't. I'm too scared, too tired, too worn down by years of looking over my shoulder and finding him there, always there, 200 feet behind me no matter how far I run. He's watching me right now. I can feel it, even as I write this, that familiar pressure at the edge of my awareness. I won't look. I've learned that looking doesn't change anything. He'll be there whether I see him or not, standing in the darkness, waiting for something only he understands. 200 feet away, for now. Story 4. The storage unit that smelled like perfume. The smell hit me the moment I rolled up the door. Floral and dense, like walking into a garden in full bloom, except it was November and I was standing in a concrete hallway lined with metal storage units. The scent was so strong it made my eyes water, so unexpected that I actually took a step back, half convinced I'd opened the wrong unit. But the number matched, E147, and the padlock had clicked open with the key I'd been given, so this was definitely the right place. This was definitely my aunt's unit. It just shouldn't have smelled like anything except dust and cardboard and stale air. My Aunt Ruth had died 3 months earlier, quietly and alone in her apartment across town. Heart attack in her sleep, the coroner said. She was 78 and had been living on her own since before I was born. The kind of woman who kept her distance from family gatherings and sent Christmas cards with nothing but her signature inside. I'd seen her maybe a dozen times in my entire life, and most of those had been at funerals for other relatives. We weren't close. I'm not sure she was close to anyone, but I was her only living relative, which meant I'd inherited everything she owned. The apartment had been easy enough to deal with, a cleaning crew, a donation service, and a real estate agent who'd handled the sale. The storage unit was the last piece, the final item on my checklist before I could close the book on Aunt Ruth and go back to my normal life. I'd expected to spend a few hours sorting through old furniture and boxes of junk, maybe find a few things worth keeping, donate the rest. I hadn't expected to walk into a wall of perfume so thick I could taste it. The unit was about 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, packed floor to ceiling with the accumulated debris of a lifetime. Cardboard boxes stacked 3 high, furniture draped with sheets that had yellowed with age, plastic bins labeled in my aunt's cramped handwriting. A floor lamp stood in one corner like a sentinel, its shade water-stained and crooked. An old steamer trunk sat against the back wall, the kind of thing that belonged in a movie about ocean liners and glamorous voyages. Everything was coated with a thin layer of dust, undisturbed for what looked like years. But the smell was fresh, alive almost, like someone had sprayed perfume into the unit just before I arrived, soaking the air with that heavy floral scent. Roses, I thought, or maybe gardenias. Something old-fashioned, the kind of fragrance my grandmother used to wear, the kind that came in cut glass bottles with rubber squeeze bulbs. It didn't belong here, in this climate-controlled corridor with its humming fluorescent lights and faint smell of industrial cleaner. It didn't make sense. I stepped inside anyway. I had a job to do. The first few boxes were exactly what I'd expected. Old clothes wrapped in tissue paper, the fabric brittle and faded. Kitchen utensils that hadn't been used in decades. Books with broken spines and yellowed pages, mostly romance novels and Reader's Digest condensed editions. I sorted through them methodically, making piles for donation and trash, trying to ignore the perfume that seemed to grow stronger the deeper I went into the unit. It was in the 4th box that I found the photographs. They were loose, not in an album, just a stack of maybe 50 pictures held together with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. Most of them were old, black and white, or that washed-out color that photographs got in the 60s and 70s. I recognized my aunt in a few of them. Younger, thinner, with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. There were other faces I didn't know, relatives probably, people who'd died before I was born, or who'd drifted out of the family orbit so long ago that no one remembered their names. But there was one face that appeared more than any other. A young woman with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She was in at least 20 of the photographs, sometimes alone, sometimes standing next to my aunt. In one picture they were holding hands. In another, my aunt had her arm around the woman's shoulders, pulling her close. They looked like sisters. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't my aunt's, someone had written a single word: Margaret. I didn't know anyone named Margaret. My aunt had never mentioned a sister, and neither had anyone else in the family. As far as I knew, she'd been an only child, just like my mother had been. But these photographs told a different story. These photographs showed 2 women who clearly knew each other well, who'd spent time together, who might have been closer than close. I kept digging. Found more photographs, more evidence of this Margaret person. Found letters, too, bundled with twine and tucked into the corner of a box full of old magazines. The envelopes were addressed to my aunt in that same unfamiliar handwriting, the return address, a town I'd never heard of about 2 hours north of here. The letters themselves were brief and cryptic, references to shared memories, inside jokes I didn't understand, expressions of affection that seemed too intense for casual friendship. Whoever Margaret was, she'd mattered to my aunt. She'd mattered a lot. And then I found the last letter in the bundle. It was different from the others, typed instead of handwritten, formal instead of intimate. A death certificate, I realized as I unfolded it. Margaret Holloway died March 15th, 1973. Cause of death listed as accidental. She'd been 24 years old. My aunt had kept the death certificate for over 50 years, had kept it bundled with Margaret's letters, preserved like a relic, hidden away in a storage unit that smelled like flowers, even though it had been sealed for months. I sat there on the concrete floor of Unit E-147, surrounded by boxes and photographs and the heavy sweetness of that impossible perfume, and I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My aunt had a sister, or something like a sister, someone named Margaret who'd died young in 1973. The family had never mentioned her, had never spoken her name, at least not in front of me. It was like she'd been erased from history, scrubbed from the family tree so thoroughly that I'd lived my entire life without knowing she existed. But the perfume, that was the thing I couldn't explain. The unit had been sealed since my aunt's death, probably longer. No one had been inside for months, maybe years. There was no source for that smell, no bottle of perfume sitting open on one of the shelves, no sachet tucked between the boxes. It was just there, hanging in the air, getting stronger every minute I spent inside. I gathered up the photographs and the letters and shoved them into my bag. I'd sort through them later, at home, where the air didn't taste like a funeral arrangement. I needed to get out of this unit, needed to breathe something that didn't remind me of flowers and death and secrets that had been buried for half a century. But as I pulled down the rolling door and clicked the padlock shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd disturbed something I shouldn't have, that by opening those boxes and reading those letters, I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The perfume wasn't my aunt's. She'd worn something sharper, more astringent. I remembered that from the few times I'd hugged her at family events. This was different, softer, older. This was Margaret's perfume, and it had no business being here, 50 years after she'd died. I thought it would end when I left at the storage facility. Thought the smell would stay behind with the boxes and the dust and whatever strange atmospheric anomaly had conjured it in the first place. But when I got home and pulled the photographs out of my bag, the scent rose up to meet me like a greeting. Faint at first, barely noticeable over the coffee I'd made and the lingering smell of the Thai food I'd had for lunch. But definitely there. Definitely that same floral sweetness, those same gardenias or roses or whatever it was, clinging to the old paper like it had been sprayed on yesterday. I spread the photographs across my kitchen table and stared at Margaret's face for a long time. She really was striking in that old Hollywood way that doesn't quite translate to modern standards of beauty. High cheekbones, a sharp jaw, eyes that seemed to catch the light and hold it. In almost every picture, she was looking directly at the camera, and in almost every picture, I felt like she was looking at me specifically. Not at whoever had taken the photograph 50 years ago. At me, here, now, sitting in my kitchen with her letters in my hands and her perfume in my nose. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The dead don't stare. The dead don't wear perfume. Whatever I was experiencing was just the power of suggestion, my brain filling in details that weren't really there because I'd stumbled onto something sad and strange and my imagination was running wild with it. I poured myself a glass of wine and started reading the letters. They told a story once I figured out the chronology. Ruth and Margaret had met in 1968 when they were both in their early 20s. They'd worked at the same department store downtown in an era when single women lived in boarding houses and spent their weekends at dances hoping to meet husbands. Except Ruth and Margaret hadn't been interested in husbands. They'd been interested in each other. The letters made that much clear. Not explicitly, they were written in a kind of code, the way people had to write about such things back then. But the meaning came through in the endearments, the longing, the desperate affection that bled through every line. Margaret called Ruth her dearest friend and her constant companion and the other half of my heart. Ruth's letters weren't in the bundle, but I could piece together her responses from Margaret's replies. They'd loved each other, deeply, secretly, in a world that wouldn't have allowed them to love openly. And then, in March of 1973, Margaret had died. The letters stopped abruptly after that. No more envelopes, no more cramped handwriting, no more expressions of devotion, just the death certificate, folded and tucked away like a bookmark in a story that had ended too soon. I tried to imagine what my aunt's life must have been like after that. The grief she couldn't share, the loss she couldn't explain, the decades of silence that followed. She'd never married, never had close friends, as far as anyone knew. She'd lived alone in that apartment for 40 years, keeping her distance from family, sending Christmas cards with nothing inside but her name. She'd been mourning Margaret. For 50 years, she'd been mourning a woman no one in the family even knew existed. I should have felt sad, should have felt something like sympathy for this lonely aunt I'd never really known. But instead, I felt uneasy. Something about the letters, the photographs, the perfume that kept getting stronger despite the open windows and the air freshener I'd sprayed in desperation. Something was wrong. The story was too neat, too tragic, too much like a movie that was building toward a twist I hadn't seen yet. I decided to do some research. Margaret Holloway died March 15, 1973. Accidental death. That's what the death certificate said. But death certificates don't tell you much about the accident itself, about what actually happened, about whether accidental was the whole truth or just the official story. The town where Margaret had lived was small enough that the local newspaper had digitized its archives. I found the obituary easily. Margaret Ann Holloway, beloved daughter, taken too soon, memorial service at First Baptist Church. But it was the news article from 2 days earlier that made my stomach drop. The headline read, "Woman Found Dead in Apparent Fall." The article was brief, the way local news often is when the subject is uncomfortable. Margaret had been found at the bottom of a ravine in the woods outside of town, her neck broken, her body discovered by hikers 3 days after she disappeared. The official ruling was accidental death. She'd been walking alone, had slipped on loose rocks, had tumbled down a slope too steep to survive. A tragedy. A senseless loss. Case closed. But there was a detail in the article that the death certificate hadn't mentioned. Margaret hadn't been alone when she went into those woods. She'd been with a friend, a woman named Ruth Delacroix, who'd told police she'd gone home early because of a headache, who'd said she had no idea Margaret had continued walking by herself, who'd been the last person to see her alive. My aunt had been there. I sat at my kitchen table with the laptop screen glowing in front of me and the smell of flowers so thick it was making me dizzy, and I tried to make sense of what I'd just read. Ruth had been with Margaret the day she died. Ruth had gone home early and left her alone. Ruth had been interviewed by police as the last known witness. The official ruling was accidental. But accidents don't haunt you for 50 years. Accidents don't make you keep someone's death certificate bundled with their love letters. Accidents don't make you seal away their photographs in a storage unit and never speak their name again, unless they weren't really accidents at all. The perfume was everywhere now, not just on the photographs, not just lingering in the air, everywhere, in my clothes, in my hair, in the fabric of my couch when I sat down. I couldn't escape it, couldn't open enough windows or spray enough air freshener to cover it up. It was like something had followed me home from that storage unit, something that wanted me to know it was there, something that wanted me to keep digging. I went back to the storage unit the next day, told myself I was just finishing what I'd started, that I needed to sort through the rest of my aunt's belongings and get the place cleared out before the monthly rental came due. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the photograph I'd found tucked into the last letter, the one I hadn't noticed until I was lying in bed at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, flipping through the stack one more time. It showed Ruth and Margaret standing at the edge of a wooded area, trees stretching out behind them into shadow. Margaret was smiling at the camera, that same intense stare she had in all her pictures. Ruth was looking at Margaret, and in Ruth's expression, in her eyes, in the set of her jaw, in the way her hand rested on Margaret's shoulder, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Something that looked less like love and more like possession, less like devotion and more like obsession. The photograph was dated February 1973, 1 month before Margaret died. The storage facility was quiet when I arrived, that particular Sunday morning emptiness that made my footsteps echo in the concrete corridor. I rolled up the door to E147, expecting the perfume to hit me again, bracing myself for that overwhelming floral assault. But the smell was different this time. Still there, still that same gardenia sweetness, but underneath it was something else. Something darker, almost metallic, like flowers arranged around a hospital bed, like a funeral home trying to mask what funeral homes always try to mask. I started going through the boxes more carefully this time, looking for anything that might explain what had really happened in those woods. My aunt had been a meticulous record keeper. I'd found tax returns from the 1980s and receipts for appliances she'd thrown away decades ago. If there was evidence of what she'd done, or hadn't done, or couldn't bring herself to forget, it would be here, hidden away in one of these boxes, waiting for someone to find it. The steamer trunk against the back wall was locked. I'd noticed it the day before, but hadn't bothered with it, assuming it was just more old clothes or family heirlooms nobody wanted. But now, with the smell growing stronger and the questions multiplying in my head, the locked trunk felt significant, important. Like whatever I was looking for was inside, sealed away where no one was supposed to find it. I found a crowbar in the facility's maintenance closet and pried the lock off. The metal gave way with a screech that seemed too loud in the enclosed space, and I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting something to jump out at me. Nothing did. But what I found inside was almost worse. The trunk was full of Margaret's things. Not just photographs and letters, but everything. Clothes that still smelled faintly of perfume even after 50 years. A hairbrush with dark strands still caught in the bristles. A journal, the cover worn soft from handling, filled with Margaret's handwriting. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a silk scarf like a sacred relic, a bottle of perfume. The glass was cut crystal, the label faded but still readable. Jardin de Nuit, Garden of Night. The bottle was half empty, the rubber squeeze bulb cracked and brittle with age. I didn't touch it. Couldn't make myself touch it, because the bottle was sealed. The perfume inside hadn't been exposed to air in decades, maybe not since the day Margaret died. And yet the smell was everywhere, in the trunk, in the unit, soaking into my clothes and my hair and the back of my throat until I could taste it. The journal was worse. Margaret had written in it almost daily, documenting her life with the kind of detail that felt almost compulsive. Her job at the department store, her boarding house with its thin walls and nosy landlady, her dreams of saving enough money to move to California and start over somewhere no one knew her, and Ruth. Page after page about Ruth, how they'd met, how they'd fallen in love, how they'd planned a future together that they both knew might never be possible. But the last entries were different. In the weeks before her death, Margaret's tone had shifted from hopeful to frightened. She wrote about arguments, about Ruth's jealousy, her possessiveness, her anger when Margaret talked to anyone else. She wrote about wanting to leave, about feeling trapped, about a fight they'd had the week before where Ruth had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. She wrote about being scared. The final entry was dated March 14th, 1973, the day before she died. R wants to go for a walk tomorrow. Says she has something important to tell me, something that will change everything. I don't know what she means. I'm afraid to find out. But I can't say no to her. I've never been able to say no to her. I just hope whatever she wants to tell me is good news. I don't think I can take any more bad. I sat on the floor of the storage unit with Margaret's journal in my hands and read that entry 3 times, 4 times, 5. The words didn't change. The implication didn't soften. Ruth had taken Margaret into the woods with something important to tell her, and Margaret had never come out alive. The smell was so strong now, I could barely breathe. It filled my lungs with every inhale, coated my tongue, made my eyes water until tears were streaming down my face. And underneath the flowers, that other smell was growing too. The metallic darkness, the decay, the thing the perfume was trying to hide. I gagged, pressed my hand over my mouth, tried to stand up and get out of the unit before I was sick. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper coming from somewhere behind me, from somewhere inside the trunk, or maybe from everywhere at once. A woman's voice, soft and sad and achingly familiar, even though I'd never heard it before in my life. She pushed me. I spun around. The unit was empty, just boxes and furniture and dust motes floating in the fluorescent light. No one there, no one visible. But the smell surged again, so powerful it drove me to my knees. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. Margaret was here. Margaret had been here all along, trapped in this unit with her belongings and her memories and the truth about how she'd died, waiting for someone to find her, waiting for someone to listen. She pushed me, the voice said again, closer now, almost in my ear. And no one ever knew. I ran, left the trunk open, left the journal on the floor, left everything and sprinted down the corridor toward the exit. The smell chased me, that terrible floral sweetness mixed with something rotten underneath, and I could hear footsteps behind me even though there was no one there, could feel breath on the back of my neck, even though that was impossible, completely impossible. I made it to my car and drove away without looking back. But I knew, even as I pulled out of the parking lot with my hands shaking on the wheel, that it wasn't over. Margaret had waited 50 years to tell her story. She wasn't going to let me walk away now. The smell was waiting for me when I got home. Not faint this time, not subtle, overwhelming, suffocating, so thick I could see it almost, a shimmer in the air like heat rising off summer pavement. I stood in my doorway and stared at my apartment, at the space that had been mine and normal and safe just 2 days ago. And I understood that none of those things were true anymore. Margaret had followed me home, or maybe she'd been here all along, waiting in the photographs and letters I'd brought with me, biding her time until I knew enough to understand what she wanted. I didn't go inside, couldn't make myself cross that threshold into the perfumed darkness. Instead, I sat on my front steps as the sun went down, watching the shadows lengthen across my lawn, trying to figure out what to do. I could throw it all away, the photographs, the letters, the journal I'd left behind. I could clear out the storage unit, donate everything to Goodwill, pretend I'd never found any of it. Let Margaret's secret stay buried for another 50 years, until someone else stumbled across it, or until it was finally forgotten entirely. But even as I thought it, I knew I couldn't. Not after what I'd heard. Not after that voice, that desperate whisper in my ear, the raw grief of a woman who'd been murdered by someone she loved and then erased from existence. She'd been waiting half a century for someone to know the truth. I couldn't be the one to bury it again. The question was what to do instead. I went back to the storage unit the next morning, armed with garbage bags and a determination I didn't entirely feel. The smell hit me the moment I stepped into the corridor, that same floral assault, but this time I pushed through it. I had to get the journal. I had to have proof, something concrete I could show someone, something that would make this real outside my own head. The unit was exactly as I'd left it, trunk open, journal on the floor, boxes scattered from my frantic exit. But something had changed. The photographs I'd looked at the day before, the ones of Ruth and Margaret together, were arranged on top of the nearest box in a neat row. 5 pictures, laid out side by side, showing the progression of their relationship. First meeting, first embrace, a picnic somewhere sunny, a Christmas with a small tree in the background, and the last one, the one from the woods, with Ruth's hand on Margaret's shoulder and that terrible possessive look in her eyes. I hadn't arranged them like that. I knew I hadn't. But there they were, laid out like evidence, like an accusation, like a story being told by someone who couldn't tell it any other way. I picked up the journal and flipped to the last entry. The words were the same as before, but now there was something written beneath them, in handwriting that was shakier, more desperate, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had torn through in places. Tell them what she did. Tell them the truth. Don't let her get away with it. The ink was fresh. I could smell it under the perfume, that sharp chemical scent of a pen that had just been used. But that was impossible. The journal had been sealed in a trunk for 50 years. No one had been in this unit since I'd run out the day before. No one living, anyway. I took the journal and the photographs and drove to the police station. I don't know what I expected. For them to believe me, maybe, or at least to listen. But the officer at the front desk looked at me like I was crazy when I started explaining. A 50-year-old death, ruled accidental, no witnesses, no evidence except a journal that might or might not be authentic, and a story about perfume and voices that I couldn't prove to anyone. He took my information, said someone would be in touch, and sent me on my way with the kind of polite dismissal that meant I'd never hear from them again. I tried the newspaper next. A reporter who covered cold cases, someone I'd found through a Google search who'd written about unsolved mysteries and forgotten crimes. She was more interested than the police had been, listened to my whole story, looked through the photographs, read the journal entries with a furrowed brow that suggested she was taking this seriously. But when I mentioned the smell, the voice, the fresh writing that had appeared overnight, her expression changed, became careful, guarded, the way people look at you when they're calculating how quickly they can end the conversation. "This is certainly compelling," she said, sliding the journal back across the table. "But without corroborating evidence, without witnesses, without anything to tie your aunt directly to Margaret's death except speculation." She spread her hands apologetically. "I'm sorry. It's not something I can pursue." I drove home with the journal on the passenger seat and the smell of perfume filling my car despite every window being open. I'd failed. I'd tried to tell Margaret's story, tried to bring her killer to some kind of justice, and I'd been dismissed as a grieving relative with an overactive imagination. The police didn't care. The press didn't care. No one was going to investigate a death from 1973 based on the diary of a woman who might have been paranoid, might have been exaggerating, might have simply fallen off a cliff the way the official report said she had. When I got home, the apartment was dark, even though I'd left the lights on. I stood in the doorway, fumbling for the switch, and that's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, cold and light and impossibly real, turning me around to face something I couldn't see. The smell was everywhere. In my mouth, in my lungs, in the space between my thoughts. And the voice was there too, no longer a whisper, but clear and close, spoken directly into my ear by lips I could almost feel brushing against my skin. "If they won't listen," Margaret said, "then make them see." The lights came on. The hand was gone. I was alone in my apartment, gasping for breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. But on my kitchen table, arranged in the same neat row as they'd been in the storage unit, were the photographs, and next to them, a pen and a blank sheet of paper. Margaret wasn't asking me to tell someone. She was asking me to tell everyone, to write it down, make it permanent, put her story somewhere it couldn't be ignored or dismissed or forgotten. I sat down at the table. I picked up the pen, and I started to write. I wrote for 3 days straight, barely slept, barely ate, just sat at my kitchen table with the photographs spread around me and Margaret's journal open to the final entry, and let the words pour out of me like something had been uncorked. I wrote about Ruth and Margaret, about their love and their secrets, and the world that wouldn't let them be together openly. I wrote about the woods and the ravine, and the lie that had been accepted as truth for 50 years. I wrote about the storage unit and the perfume and the voice that had whispered in my ear, begging someone to finally know what had really happened. The smell stayed with me the entire time, not overwhelming anymore, not suffocating, just present, a constant floral undertone to everything I did. It felt like company, like Margaret was sitting beside me, reading over my shoulder, making sure I got the details right. Sometimes I'd pause, searching for the right word or the right way to phrase something, and the scent would shift slightly, grow warmer or cooler, as if she was guiding me toward what she wanted me to say. When I finished, I had 40 pages. I read through them once, twice, made corrections and revisions, until my eyes burned and my hand cramped from holding the pen. Then I scanned everything into my computer and started looking for places to share it. I posted Margaret's story everywhere I could think of. True crime forums, local history groups, social media pages dedicated to cold cases and unsolved mysteries. I included scans of the photographs, the journal entries, the death certificate with its clinical listing of accidental. I didn't editorialize or accuse directly. I just laid out the evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. Margaret Holloway died in 1973. Ruth Delacroix was the last person to see her alive. Here is what Margaret wrote in the days before her death. Here is what I found in my aunt's storage unit, preserved like a shrine to a woman the family had tried to forget. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, the story had been shared thousands of times. People who'd grown up in that small town started coming forward with memories. A neighbor who'd always thought there was something strange about the official story, a former co-worker who remembered Ruth's possessiveness, an elderly woman who claimed she'd heard Ruth and Margaret arguing in the woods that day but had been too afraid to say anything. The cold case reporter who'd dismissed me called back, suddenly interested now that there was public pressure and new witnesses emerging from the woodwork. 2 months later, the case was officially reopened. They couldn't prosecute anyone, of course. Ruth was dead, and even if she'd been alive, the statute of limitations had long since expired. But they reviewed the evidence, interviewed the witnesses who were still living, and issued a revised finding. Margaret Holloway's death was reclassified from accidental to undetermined, with evidence suggesting possible foul play. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was acknowledgement. It was the truth, finally, after half a century of silence. The day the announcement was made, I went back to the storage unit one last time. I'd been putting it off for weeks, dreading the return, unsure what I'd find, but something felt different now. A lightness in my chest, a sense of completion that hadn't been there before. Margaret's story had been told. Her death had been recognized. Whatever she'd been waiting for, whatever had kept her tethered to that collection of photographs and letters and memories, maybe it was enough now. Maybe she could finally rest. The unit was quiet when I rolled up the door. No overwhelming perfume, no whispers from empty corners, just dust and cardboard, and the stale air of a space that had been closed up for too long. The steamer trunk was still open, Margaret's belongings still scattered where I'd left them, but the atmosphere had changed. The weight was gone. The presence that had pressed against me every time I'd entered this space had lifted, dissipated, moved on to wherever spirits go when they've finished what they needed to do. I packed everything carefully, the photographs, the letters, the journal with its desperate final entry. The bottle of Jardin de Nuit, still sealed, still half full of perfume that should have evaporated decades ago. I didn't know what to do with any of it, couldn't bring myself to throw it away, couldn't imagine keeping it in my home where the memories would linger. In the end, I donated most of Ruth's belongings to a historical society in the town where she and Margaret had lived. They were creating an exhibit about LGBTQ history in the region, about the hidden lives people had been forced to lead before the world became slightly more accepting. Margaret's story would be part of it. Her love, her fear, her death, all of it preserved and remembered instead of sealed away in a storage unit, forgotten. The perfume I kept, I don't know why. Maybe because it was the last tangible piece of Margaret, the thing that had first alerted me to her presence, the scent that had followed me home and refused to let me rest until I'd done what she needed. I put the bottle on a shelf in my office where I can see it every day, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I catch a whiff of gardenias when there's no explanation for it. A brief floral sweetness that rises and fades before I can be sure it was ever there at all. I tell myself it's just the bottle. That old perfume must release molecules slowly over time, that there's a scientific explanation for everything. But I don't really believe that. I think Margaret is still here, in some way. Not trapped anymore, not desperate, not whispering accusations into my ear. Just present, watching, making sure her story stays told. My Aunt Ruth took something precious from this world in 1973. She took a young woman who loved her, who trusted her, who followed her into the woods, believing they had a future together. And then she spent 50 years hiding what she'd done, sealing away the evidence, letting Margaret's memory rot in a storage unit while she lived out her quiet, solitary life. But secrets don't stay buried forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when it takes half a century, even when everyone involved is dead and gone. Margaret found a way to speak, and I was the one who listened. I was the one who told her story, who made sure she wouldn't be forgotten, who finally gave her the acknowledgement she'd been denied. The storage unit is empty now, cleaned out, swept clean, ready for the next person to fill it with their own accumulation of memories and objects and things too painful to keep, but too precious to throw away. Someone else will rent it eventually, will stack their boxes against the walls and lock the door and walk away without thinking about what came before. But I'll remember. I'll remember the smell that hit me the moment I rolled up that door, the photographs of a woman with dark hair and intense eyes, the voice that whispered, "She pushed me," in a storage unit that should have been empty. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the air is still, I'll catch a trace of gardenias drifting through my home, soft and sweet and impossible. Margaret saying thank you. Margaret, reminding me she's still here. Story 5, The Silhouette, standing at the end of the hall. The hallway in my apartment was the reason I almost didn't take the place. It was long, absurdly long, for a one-bedroom, stretching from the front door, past the bathroom and bedroom, to the living room at the far end. During the day, with sunlight streaming through the living room windows, it looked charming. Hardwood floors, crown molding, the kind of pre-war architectural details you don't find in newer buildings. But at night, when the only light came from whatever room I happened to be in, that hallway became something else entirely. A tunnel, a throat, the kind of darkness that felt solid, like you could reach out and touch it. I took the apartment anyway. It was cheap for the neighborhood, and I was a second-grade teacher who couldn't afford to be picky about things like hallway length or the quality of darkness. Besides, I'd lived alone before. I knew how to handle the creaks and shadows that come with old buildings. I knew how to tell myself that the sounds I heard were just the radiator, just the neighbors, just the building settling into its bones the way buildings do when they've been standing for 100 years. I moved in on a Saturday in early October, when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp autumn bite that makes everything feel temporary. My friend Jenna helped me carry boxes up the 3 flights of stairs, and we spent the afternoon unpacking and arranging furniture and drinking wine from plastic cups because I couldn't find the box with my glasses. By the time she left, the sun was going down and the apartment was starting to feel like home. Small and cluttered and imperfect, but mine. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The radiator clanked and hissed, and somewhere outside a car alarm went off briefly before falling silent, but none of it bothered me. I was exhausted from the move, from the weeks of packing and planning and saying goodbye to my old place. I fell asleep almost instantly and didn't wake up until my alarm went off at 6:30, gray morning light filtering through curtains I hadn't hung yet. It was the 3rd night when I first saw it. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, the way you do, stumbling out of bed half asleep with my phone in my hand for light. The bathroom was about halfway down that long hallway, and I'd left the door open because I lived alone and there was no one to close it for. I did what I needed to do, washed my hands, and stepped back out into the hall. That's when I noticed the shape at the far end. The living room was dark. I'd turned off all the lights before bed, but there was a faint glow coming from the streetlight outside, filtering through the windows and casting just enough illumination to see outlines. And there, standing in the doorway between the hall and the living room, was a figure, a silhouette, person-shaped, tall and still, darker than the darkness around it. I froze with my hand still on the bathroom doorframe, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first thought was that someone had broken in, that I'd left a window unlocked or the front door hadn't latched properly, and now there was a stranger in my apartment standing 20 feet away from me in the dark. Hello? My voice came out thin and reedy, not at all the commanding tone I used with my students. Who's there? The silhouette didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, that dark shape against the slightly less dark background of my living room, as motionless as a photograph. I raised my phone, fumbled with the flashlight app, finally got the beam to click on. The light cut through the hallway, bright and harsh, illuminating the hardwood floor and the crown molding and the empty doorway at the far end. Empty. There was no one there. No figure, no silhouette. Nothing but the living room beyond with its half-unpacked boxes and the couch I'd positioned under the window. I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, scanning every corner of the hallway for something that could explain what I'd seen. A coat on a hook, maybe. A shadow cast by passing headlights. Anything. There was nothing. The hallway was empty. The apartment was silent except for the hiss of the radiator and the distant sound of rain starting to fall against the windows. I went back to bed eventually, but I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark with my phone clutched in my hand, listening for sounds that didn't come, watching the slice of hallway visible through my bedroom door for shapes that didn't appear. By the time my alarm went off, I'd convinced myself it had been a dream, a half-waking hallucination, the kind your brain conjures when you're not quite asleep and not quite awake. I'd been exhausted, disoriented, still adjusting to a new space. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. I believed that for almost a week. Went to work, taught my classes, came home to my new apartment and made dinner and watched TV and went to bed like a normal person. I didn't see anything in the hallway. Didn't hear anything unusual. The apartment was just an apartment, old and creaky and full of character, but not haunted, not wrong. Just a place where I lived. Then it happened again. Same time, roughly, somewhere around 3 a.m., that dead hour when even the city outside seems to hold its breath. I'd gotten up for water this time, padded down the hall to the kitchen, filled a glass from the tap, and when I turned around to go back to bed, there it was again, the silhouette, standing at the far end of the hallway, right where the hall met the bedroom doorway, as still and dark as it had been before. This time I didn't call out, didn't fumble for my flashlight. I just stood there, frozen, watching it watch me. Because it was watching. I could feel that much, even though I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see features, couldn't see anything except that person-shaped darkness standing where nothing should be standing. And we stayed like that for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Me at one end of the hall, the silhouette at the other, neither of us moving. The rain had picked up outside, drumming against the windows in steady waves, and the sound seemed to fill the silence between us, making it heavier somehow, more significant. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Not faded, not walked away, just gone, like it had never been there at all. One moment the silhouette was standing in my bedroom doorway, and the next moment the doorway was empty, the darkness ordinary again, the hallway just a hallway. I didn't go back to sleep that night either. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and the lights on in every room, waiting for dawn, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, couldn't rationalize it away as a dream or a shadow or a trick of the light. I'd been awake. I'd been standing right there, looking directly at it, and it had been real. As real as the floor beneath my feet. As real as the glass of water still sitting on the counter where I'd left it. Something was in my apartment, something that only appeared in the dark, that stood at the end of my hallway and watched me with eyes I couldn't see, and I had no idea what it wanted. I started sleeping with the hallway light on after that. It felt childish, like something a kid would do to keep the monsters away. But I didn't care. The light turned that long, dark corridor into something manageable, something I could see from one end to the other without straining my eyes or imagining shapes in the shadows. I told myself it was just a precaution, a temporary measure until I figured out what was going on. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid of my own apartment, afraid of a hallway I had to walk through a dozen times a day. For almost 2 weeks, the light seemed to work. I'd get up in the middle of the night for water or the bathroom, and the hallway would be empty, normal, just a stretch of hardwood floor and white walls illuminated by the 40-watt bulb I'd screwed into the ceiling fixture. I started to relax, started to think that maybe the silhouette needed darkness to exist, that keeping the lights on was enough to banish it. I even laughed about it with Jenna over drinks one Saturday, told her I'd been seeing things in my new place and had resorted to sleeping with a nightlight like a 5-year-old. "Old buildings are creepy," she said, swirling her wine. "My last apartment had this water stain on the ceiling that looked exactly like a face. Freaked me out every time I noticed it." "This wasn't a water stain," I said, but I couldn't find the words to explain what it actually was. A shape that stood and watched. A darkness that felt aware. It sounded crazy even in my own head, so I just shrugged and changed the subject, and we talked about work and dating and all the normal things that normal people talk about when they're not being haunted by something they can't explain. The Tuesday after that conversation, the hallway light burned out. I noticed it when I got home from work, flipping the switch out of habit and getting nothing but a soft click in response. The bulb had seemed fine that morning. I'd walked under it on my way out, had seen its warm glow reflected on the floor, but now it was dead. No flicker, no dimming, just complete darkness filling the hallway like water pouring into a container. I had spare bulbs in the kitchen, so I grabbed one and climbed onto a chair to replace the dead one. But when I unscrewed the old bulb and looked at it, something made me pause. The glass wasn't blackened the way bulbs usually get when they burn out. It was cracked, a single thin fracture running from the base to the top of the bulb, like someone had squeezed it just hard enough to break the filament without shattering the whole thing. I told myself it was a manufacturing defect, told myself bulbs crack all the time, that thermal stress and vibration and 100 other factors could cause exactly this kind of damage. I screwed in the new bulb, tested the switch, watched the hallway flood with light again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had broken that bulb on purpose, something that didn't want the light. That night, I woke up at 3:14 a.m. to complete darkness. The new bulb was out. I knew before I even opened my eyes, could feel the weight of the dark pressing against my bedroom door, heavier than it should have been. I lay there for a long moment, my heart already pounding, trying to convince myself to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and wait for morning like a child hiding from nightmares. But I couldn't. I had to know, had to see if it was there again. I got up, slowly, carefully, every creak of the mattress sounding impossibly loud in the silence. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it without turning on the screen, not wanting the light to announce my presence. I crept toward the bedroom door, my bare feet cold against the hardwood, and peered out into the hallway. It was there, closer this time. Not at the far end of the hall anymore. Not standing in a doorway 20 feet away. It was maybe 10 feet from my bedroom, positioned in the middle of the corridor like it had been walking toward me and stopped. The silhouette was darker than ever, that person-shaped void that seemed to absorb what little light existed, and even though I still couldn't see features, I could feel it looking at me. Could feel the weight of its attention, cold and patient, waiting for something I didn't understand. I couldn't move. My hand was frozen on the doorframe, my legs locked, my entire body refusing to respond to the screaming in my brain that said, "Run, hide, get away." We stood there in the darkness, me and the silhouette, close enough now that I could have thrown something and hit it. Close enough that if it moved suddenly, if it lunged, I wouldn't have time to react. "What do you want?" The words came out as a whisper, barely audible even to my own ears. "What do you want from me?" The silhouette didn't answer, but it moved. Not toward me, sideways, sliding along the hall toward the bathroom door with a motion that wasn't quite walking. It was more like drifting, like a shadow cast by something I couldn't see, and the movement was so smooth and silent that it made my skin crawl. I watched it stop in front of the bathroom, that dark shape hovering at the threshold, and then it turned to face me again, to make sure I was watching. and then it stepped into the bathroom and disappeared. I didn't follow it. Couldn't have made myself follow it even if I'd wanted to. I just stood there in my bedroom doorway, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, until the sky outside my window started to lighten and the darkness in the hallway faded to something ordinary. When I finally worked up the courage to check the bathroom, it was empty. Just tile and porcelain and the faint smell of the lavender soap I kept by the sink. But the mirror was fogged, condensation clouding the glass like someone had just taken a hot shower, even though the faucets were dry and cold to the touch. And in the center of the fog, drawn with what looked like a fingertip, was a single word: H-E-L-P. I stared at it until the letters faded, until the fog evaporated and the mirror was clear again. Then I sat down on the bathroom floor and cried, because I understood now that this wasn't going to stop. Whatever was in my apartment, whatever had been watching me from the darkness, it wasn't just a presence. It was trying to communicate, and it needed something from me. I called in sick the next day. Couldn't face a classroom full of 7-year-olds when I'd spent the night being haunted by something that wrote messages in bathroom fog. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee I couldn't drink, and my laptop open in front of me, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. Ghost stories about the building, news articles about deaths in the area, records of who had lived in this apartment before me. The building was old enough that finding information took time. It had been constructed in 1923, had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and countless renovations that had modernized the plumbing and wiring while leaving the crown molding and hardwood floors intact. Dozens of people had lived and died here over the past century. Any one of them could be responsible for the shadow in my hallway, but it was a newspaper article from 1987 that made me stop scrolling. Local woman missing, foul play suspected. The headline was accompanied by a grainy photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile, the kind of picture that gets pulled from a family album when the news needs something to show. Her name was Caroline Marsh. She was 26 years old, a graduate student at the university downtown, and she'd lived in apartment 3C of my building. My apartment. According to the article, Caroline had been reported missing by her sister after failing to show up for a family dinner. Police had found her apartment unlocked, her purse and keys still inside, no signs of forced entry or struggle. She'd simply vanished, as if she'd walked out of her own life and never looked back. The investigation had gone nowhere. No body was ever found. No suspect was ever named. Caroline Marsh had disappeared in October of 1987, and 36 years later, no one knew what had happened to her. I read the article 3 times, my heart beating faster with each pass. A young woman living alone, vanishing without a trace from the same apartment where I now slept. It couldn't be a coincidence. The silhouette, the messages, the desperate plea for help. It had to be her. Caroline had been trying to reach me from whatever place she'd ended up, trying to tell me something about what had happened to her all those years ago. That night, I didn't try to sleep. I sat in the hallway with my back against the wall and waited for the silhouette to appear. I'd turned off all the lights deliberately, let the darkness fill the corridor the way it wanted to, and I'd brought a notebook and pen in case there were more messages to receive. I felt insane. Felt like I was doing exactly what people in horror movies do right before something terrible happens. But I couldn't ignore her anymore. If Caroline needed help, if her spirit or whatever it was had been trapped here for 36 years waiting for someone to listen, then I was going to listen. The darkness seemed to thicken around midnight. I could feel it gathering, condensing, becoming more solid in the way I'd noticed before. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath misting in front of my face, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally started, pattering against the windows with a sound like fingernails tapping on glass. She appeared at 12:47 a.m. I watched her materialize at the far end of the hall, that familiar silhouette rising out of the shadows like something emerging from deep water. She was facing me, the way she always was, and even though I couldn't see her eyes, I could feel her watching, could feel the intensity of her attention, the desperation that radiated off her like heat. Caroline? My voice shook, but I forced the word out anyway. Is that you? Are you Caroline Marsh? The silhouette didn't speak, but she moved, drifting down the hallway toward me with that same smooth, unsettling motion I'd seen before. I made myself stay still, made myself not run, even though every instinct was screaming at me to get away. She stopped about 5 feet from where I sat, close enough that I could see the shape of her more clearly now. A woman, definitely. Slight build, shoulder-length hair, hands hanging at her sides. I want to help you, I said. I found the article about your disappearance. I know something happened to you, but I don't know what, and I don't know how to help if you can't tell me. Caroline raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the end of the hall, toward the living room where the windows looked out over the street 3 stories below. She held the gesture for a long moment, making sure I understood, and then she lowered her arm and began to fade. Not disappearing all at once the way she usually did, but gradually, like mist burning off in morning sun. Before she was gone completely, I saw her mouth move. No sound came out. There was never any sound, but I could read the words on her lips, could see them formed in that dark silhouette of her face. He's still here. Then she was gone, and I was alone in the hallway with my notebook and my racing heart and a new kind of fear settling into my bones. He's still here. Not something happened to me, not I was killed. He's still here. Present tense. Whoever had hurt Caroline, whoever had made her disappear, they were still alive. Still in this building, maybe. Still close enough that she needed to warn me. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the hallway until dawn, watching the shadows, waiting for Caroline to come back. She didn't, but her words echoed in my head, over and over, a warning I couldn't ignore. He's still here. The next morning, I started researching everyone who had lived in this building in 1987. If Caroline's killer was still here, still walking these halls, still living his life like nothing had happened, then I was going to find him. I owed her that much, and maybe, if I could figure out the truth, I could finally set her free. The building had 16 units, and in 1987, 12 of them had been occupied. I found the information through a combination of old city directories, archived utility records, and a property management company that had kept files going back decades. Most of the names meant nothing to me. Families who'd moved away, elderly tenants who'd passed on, young professionals who'd scattered to other cities and other lives. But 3 of the people who'd lived here in 1987 were still here now, still walking these halls, still using the same stairwell, still collecting their mail from the same row of boxes in the lobby. Eleanor Vance, in 2A, who was now 91 and rarely left her apartment. Marcus Webb, in 4B, a retired accountant who'd lived in the building for over 40 years. And Donald Pruitt, in 1C, the building's unofficial superintendent who handled minor repairs and kept an eye on things for the property management company. I knew Donald. Not well, just the way you know someone you pass in the hallway and nod to occasionally. He was in his early 70s, tall and thin with a weathered face and hands that were always stained with something, paint or grease, or the grime of pipes he'd been fixing. He'd helped me move a bookshelf the week I arrived, had knocked on my door to let me know about a water shutoff, had been nothing but friendly in the few interactions we'd had. There was nothing sinister about him, nothing that screamed murderer. But he'd been here in 1987. He'd been here when Caroline disappeared. I started paying attention to him in a way I hadn't before. Noticed how often I saw him in the hallways, how he always seemed to be around when I was coming or going. Noticed the way he looked at me sometimes, a quick glance that lingered a half-second too long before he smiled and said hello. It could have been nothing, probably was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that underneath his friendly superintendent routine was something darker waiting. 3 nights after Caroline's warning, I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. I didn't scream, though I wanted to. The darkness in my bedroom was absolute. The hallway light had burned out again, and I'd stopped replacing it. And Caroline was just a shape at first, a density in the shadows that my sleep-fogged brain took a moment to recognize. She was closer than she'd ever been, close enough that if she'd been solid, I could have reached out and touched her. "Who was it?" I whispered. "Who hurt you? Can you show me?" She raised her hand again, pointed toward the door. Then she did something she'd never done before. She moved to the window, that smooth, drifting motion, and pressed what would have been her hand against the glass. The cold radiated outward from her touch, frosting the window in a spreading circle, and in the frost, she drew a number. 1C, Donald Pruitt's apartment. I watched the number fade as the frost melted, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Caroline turned back to me, and even though I couldn't see her face, I could feel the intensity of her gaze, the desperation that had been building for 36 years. She needed me to understand. She needed me to do something. "I believe you," I said. "I'll find proof. I'll make sure everyone knows what he did." She stood there for a moment longer, that dark silhouette framed against my bedroom window, with the city lights glowing faintly behind her. Then she lifted one hand to her throat, wrapped her fingers around it in a gesture that made my stomach lurch, not just pointing anymore, showing me how she'd died. Then she was gone, and I was alone with the knowledge of what I had to do. I should have gone to the police. I know that now. Should have told them about Caroline Marsh, about the cold case from 1987, about the superintendent who'd lived here all along and might have been responsible. But I didn't have proof. I had frost on a window that had already melted, messages in bathroom fog that had already faded, the word of a ghost that no one else could see. The police would have laughed me out of the station, or worse, they would have started asking questions about my mental health, about whether I was stable enough to live alone, to teach children. I couldn't risk that. I had to find proof on my own. I started watching Donald more carefully, noting his schedule, his habits, the times he left the building and the times he returned. I found excuses to talk to him, asked questions about the building's history, tried to steer the conversation toward 1987 without being too obvious. He was friendly, as always, happy to chat about the old days, about tenants who'd come and gone, about how the neighborhood had changed. But when I mentioned that I'd heard someone had gone missing from the building years ago, his expression flickered. Just for a second, just a brief tightening around his eyes. But I saw it. I saw him remember. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Before your time. Nothing for you to worry about." "What happened to her?" I pressed. "The woman who disappeared?" Donald shrugged, but his shoulders were tense, his hands suddenly busy adjusting a tool on his belt. "Nobody knows. She just vanished one day. Police looked into it, couldn't find anything. It happens sometimes. People deciding to start over somewhere else." "But they never found her," I said. "Doesn't that seem strange? That she'd leave everything behind, her purse, her keys, and just vanish?" He looked at me then, and something in his eyes made my blood run cold. Not anger exactly, something more calculating than that, more aware. "You've been doing your research," he said softly. "That's a lot of interest in ancient history for someone who just moved in." I made an excuse and retreated to my apartment, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. He knew. He knew I was looking into Caroline's disappearance, and he was smart enough to wonder why. I'd pushed too hard, asked too many questions, and now he was watching me the same way I'd been watching him. That night, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate, stopping right at my threshold. I held my breath and watched the shadows shift in the gap between the door and the floor. Someone was standing there. Someone was listening. The footsteps moved away after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness with my phone in my hand, ready to call 911, and waited for morning. When dawn finally came, I found something that made my heart stop. A note had been slipped under my door, just a scrap of paper torn from a notebook with 4 words written in blocky handwriting. Stop asking questions. I stared at it for a long time, that little piece of paper that confirmed everything I suspected. Donald Pruitt had killed Caroline Marsh. He'd gotten away with it for 36 years, and now he knew I was getting close to the truth. The question was what he was going to do about it. I went to the police that morning, showed them the note, told them about Caroline Marsh, explained that I believed her disappearance was connected to the building superintendent who still lived downstairs. The officer who took my statement was patient but skeptical, the way cops get when they've heard too many stories from people who watch too many crime documentaries. He promised they'd look into it, asked me to call if anything else happened, and sent me on my way with the distinct impression that my report was going straight into a filing cabinet, where it would gather dust until the end of time. I went home anyway. I didn't know what else to do. The note had scared me. I'd be lying if I said it hadn't. But leaving felt like abandoning Caroline. She'd been waiting 36 years for someone to help her. I couldn't just pack my bags and run because things had gotten dangerous. I couldn't let Donald win again. That night, I made sure every lock was secure, checked the windows twice, wedged a chair under the doorknob the way I'd seen people do in movies, kept my phone fully charged and within reach. The rain had returned, drumming against the windows in steady sheets, and I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching the hallway, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, the power went out. The darkness came all at once, the lights extinguishing like candles blown out by a sudden wind. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, swept the beam across the room. Empty. The hallway beyond was a tunnel of shadow, the beam barely penetrating the thick black that filled it. I could hear the rain, could hear my own breathing, could hear footsteps. In the hall outside my apartment, slow, deliberate, stopping at my door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting jumping shadows on the walls, and I watched the door like it was the only thing in the world. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense him there, could feel the weight of his presence on the other side of that thin barrier of wood and locks. Then I heard the scratch of metal against metal, a key sliding into the lock. The superintendent had keys to every apartment in the building. Of course he did. That was his job, to maintain the units, to handle emergencies, to let himself in whenever he needed to. I'd never thought about it before, never considered how vulnerable that made me. But I was thinking about it now, watching the doorknob turn, watching the chair I'd wedged there start to shift. I ran for the bedroom, slammed the door behind me, locked it, shoved my dresser in front of it with strength I didn't know I had. It wouldn't hold for long. I knew that. Could already hear Donald pushing through the front door, could hear the chair scraping across the floor as he forced his way inside. But it was something. A few more seconds to call for help, to scream, to do anything except stand there and wait to die. I was dialing 911 when the bedroom went cold. Not the gradual chill I'd felt before, when Caroline was gathering herself to appear. This was sudden, absolute, a plunge into Arctic temperatures that made my breath frost in front of my face and my fingers go numb around the phone. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, to solidify, and I felt rather than saw Caroline materialize beside me. Not the faint silhouette from before, something stronger, something more present. The bedroom door shuddered as Donald hit it from the other side. Once, twice. The dresser scraped backward an inch, 2 inches. He was coming through. He was going to finish what he'd started 36 years ago, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. But Caroline could. She moved past me, that smooth drifting motion, and positioned herself in front of the door just as it burst open. Donald stumbled through, wild-eyed and breathing hard, something metallic glinting in his hand. A knife, I realized, long and sharp and meant for me. He took one step into the room, and then he saw her. I don't know what he saw. I don't know if ghosts look different to the people who created them, if Caroline appeared to him as the woman he'd killed rather than the shadow I'd been seeing. But whatever it was, stopped him dead. His face went white, his mouth opening in a scream that never came, and he staggered backward like he'd been shoved by invisible hands. "No," he whispered. "No, you're not real. You can't be real." Caroline didn't speak, didn't need to. She just moved toward him, that dark silhouette growing larger, filling the doorway, filling the room, becoming something vast and terrible and utterly inescapable. Donald tried to run, but his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed in the hallway, scrambling backward on his hands and knees, and Caroline followed. Slow, patient, inevitable. I heard him screaming all the way down the hall, heard the front door bang open, heard his footsteps pounding down the stairwell, heard the crash that came a few seconds later, followed by silence. Then the cold lifted, the darkness retreated, and I was alone in my bedroom, shaking so hard I could barely stand. The police found Donald at the bottom of the stairwell with a broken neck. They found the knife next to him, and in the pocket of his jacket, a key to my apartment that he shouldn't have had, a copy he'd made without authorization, worn smooth from years of use. They also found, hidden in the walls of his apartment behind a false panel, a collection of items that would later be identified as belonging to Caroline Marsh. Her wallet, her student ID, a locket with a picture of her sister inside. The investigation that followed revealed everything. Donald had been obsessed with Caroline, had watched her for months before that October night in 1987. When she'd rejected his advances, he'd used his superintendent key to let himself in, had strangled her in the hallway of apartment 3C, and had disposed of her body somewhere that was never found. He'd lived with that secret for 36 years, walking the same halls, sleeping in the same building, watching other young women come and go. I wasn't the first person he'd threatened since Caroline, but I was the last. They closed the case a month later. Caroline Marsh's death was officially ruled a homicide, and even though her killer had died before he could face trial, the truth was finally known. Her sister held a memorial service that I attended, standing in the back of a small chapel while people who'd loved Caroline said goodbye to her properly for the first time. I still live in the apartment. I know that seems strange, after everything that happened, but it feels right somehow. The hallway doesn't scare me anymore. The darkness is just darkness now, empty and ordinary, without that weight of presence that used to make my skin crawl. Caroline is gone. I felt her leave that night, after Donald fell down the stairs, a warmth that passed through the room like a sigh, a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before. She'd been trapped here for 36 years, waiting for someone to see her, to hear her, to help her find justice. And now she was free. But sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and the city is quiet, I think I catch a glimpse of something at the end of the hall. Not a threat, not a haunting, just a shape, familiar and faint, there for just a moment before it fades. I like to think it's Caroline checking in, making sure I'm okay. And every time I see her, I whisper the same thing into the darkness. Thank you for trusting me. The hallway stays empty after that, but I know she heard me. I know she's at peace, and that's enough.